Not a lot of white paper, not really right now.
Ladies and gentlemen, I ask please that you proceed towards the stage. We're about to begin our program. Thank you.
So yeah, I can go a little bit beyond 2:30, especially as we started late. And the folks in the back, just let them look maybe. I guess they're, yeah.
I can let them know. But
Yeah, okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Manhattan Institute's Innovation in Infrastructure event. I'm John Ketchum, the Director of Cities here at MI, and it's my distinct privilege to lead today's program, which brings together policy experts, scholars, and officials with decades of real-world experience to discuss the promise and pitfalls of innovation in American infrastructure projects. Today, we will hear from Howard Milstein, who chaired the New York State Thruway Authority through the procurement of the Tappan Zee Bridge replacement. He has authored a Manhattan Institute issue brief right here and available at the table in the back. It's been published today, and it covers his experience overseeing the public contracting process. Thanks to the expertise delivered through the consortium of private sector builders working under a design-build contract, the first project in New York to utilize this project delivery system, the now renamed Mario M. Cuomo Bridge was spared from the extensive cost overruns and long delays that frequently plague New York infrastructure projects. We're fortunate to have Mr. Milstein give us a first-hand account of that decision-making process and how it delivered for taxpayers and drivers. But today's event is just the beginning of a longer-term conversation on how to improve the efficiency and impact of American infrastructure spending. We're not only looking back to past successes, but we're looking forward to future possibilities. I am delighted to announce that the Milstein Innovation in Infrastructure project at the Manhattan Institute will continue to bring together policy experts, academics, and infrastructure practitioners to research and propose policies and practices that deliver better public value, particularly through the private sector innovations that can be brought to bear on public sector projects. To that end, the Manhattan Institute has published the first 3 installments of what will be at least 5 independent papers in the Milstein Innovation in Infrastructure project, 2 of which have been released just today. And the papers, again, can be found on the back table for your pleasure. We have the 4 authors of these 3 papers present with us here as well. Doctors Kirk Steidel, Stephen Polzin, Judge Glock, and Michael Wooten. Yes, they're all doctors, they all have PhDs. I'd like to take this opportunity in particular to thank Mr. Milstein for his support of this initiative, as well as Dr. Georgette Bennett, Managing Director at Emigrant Bank, for her invaluable input and collaboration throughout this process. Here's how our day will proceed. Mr. Milstein will first deliver a keynote address on his Tappan Zee Bridge case study, followed by a chat with me, and finally, some audience Q&A. We'll then hear our 4 authors outline their new MI issue briefs. After a break for you to refresh and get to know one another a bit better, we'll have about an hour-long panel discussion with our authors, in which I will serve as the moderator, and again, we'll have a period of Q&A for the audience. The formal program will conclude at about 5 o'clock, which will then be followed by a closing reception with refreshments. And with that, I am privileged to introduce our keynote speaker, Howard P. Milstein. Mr. Milstein is the Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of New York Private Bank and Trust and its operating bank, Emigrant Bank, and Chairman of Milstein Companies. Due to his success as a private sector entrepreneur and investor, in 2011, Governor Andrew Cuomo selected him to be the Chairman of the New York State Thruway Authority, a position he held until 2014. As we will learn in much greater detail, in this role, Mr. Milstein led the procurement process for the Tappan Zee Bridge replacement, then the largest design-build public infrastructure project in the United States, with a contract value of $3.14 billion. But that figure was $2 billion lower than the federal government's initial estimates. In recognition of his accomplishments on the bridge's replacement, Mr. Milstein received the Regional Plan Association's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2013. I encourage all of you to read Mr. Milstein's issue brief case study, and I warmly welcome him to deliver today's keynote. Thank you.
Well, I'm getting tired just remembering what we did in 2011, 12, and 13. So, in his March State of the Union address, President Biden reported that tens of thousands of clean energy jobs were being created by his climate agenda. The goal was laudable, but was it achievable? As of that time, the $7.5 billion allocated in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to EV charging stations had produced only 8 charging plazas out of the 500,000 plazas these jobs were meant to create. That's because it takes time for states to put together plans for the use of these funds. And that general topic of process is a very important one here tonight. Likewise, of the $1.6 billion designated to replace the 60-year-old Brent Spence Bridge that spans the Ohio River between Ohio and Kentucky, only $15.7 million has been spent. So, of course, as you heard, I have some experience in bridge replacement, and ever since I completed the procurement for the Tappan Zee Bridge, I have been doing briefings and op-eds about what private sector expertise can bring to large public works projects. That's why I was really pleased when the City Journal wanted to publish a case study on the Tappan Zee project, the largest infrastructure project at its time. It's also the reason that I'm so pleased to sponsor Manhattan Institute's Innovation in Infrastructure program. Manhattan Institute is absolutely the right address for a program like this. John Ketchum has assembled a distinguished group of thinkers who have produced timely and relevant papers that will give us much food for thought. You'll be hearing from 4 of them, who he mentioned earlier: Kirk Steidel, former director of Michigan Department of Transportation; Stephen Polzin, research professor, Transportation, Arizona State University; Mike Wooten, former administrator for the Federal Procurement Policy, fellow National Academy of Public Administration; Judge Glock, director in research and senior fellow, Manhattan Institute. The Manhattan Institute has also attracted the right audience to hear their papers. This audience of former and current infrastructure officials, academics, policy experts, and transportation advocates are in a position to convert thought into action. The entrepreneurial instincts that are so ingrained into the running of a private business can add a great deal of value to public infrastructure contracting. In the case of the Tappan Zee replacement, the complex environmental review process and historic design-build procurement was completed in less than 1 year. At the outset, the estimate for the new bridge was $5.4 billion, but our procurement came in at nearly $2 billion below the original estimate and was way ahead of schedule. As the process unfolded, I realized that this bridge replacement was an opportunity to create a new model of modernizing the nation's infrastructure. When we think about infrastructure bills and spending, we often act as if money is the only variable. It isn't, and it may not even be the most important variable. It's not how much you spend, but how you spend it. We need processes that are smooth, rational, efficient, and not mired in out-of-date practices. To that end, the private sector can offer important lessons for massive public works projects. I'd like to briefly highlight a few of these lessons from my New York State Thruway Authority experience. I'm not going to spend your time going into detail because you can read about that in the case studies and hear them in my fireside chat with John. I'll just share a few nuggets here. Lesson number 1, public dollars and the public trust deserve respect. I'm guided by 4 simple principles that apply to the 4 stakeholders in large-scale public projects. Those who pay for it, the hardworking taxpayers, deserve to know their dollars are being spent responsibly. Those who spend it, the government, should act with accountability and transparency. Those who build it, the contractors, who should operate with efficiency and integrity. And lastly, the results should be measurable and effective. Before I took the helm at the New York State Thruway Authority, I had the same preconceptions about civil service employees that many private sector people do. We see government as inefficient and the civil service as a place of people who couldn't make it in the private sector, people who are counting the days to retirement and their generous pensions. What I found instead were highly qualified, seasoned professionals who were struggling to do a job in a system that cheapens their work and disincentivizes them while punishing risk-taking and innovation. Entrepreneurial instincts are so ingrained in the running of a private business that they're practically muscle memory. They can help guide the process in ways that complement the highly talented government experts tasked with giant civil engineering projects. Lesson 3, civil service employees are as skilled as private sector employees, but they're taken for granted by both public and government. They deserve recognition and incentives. I was shocked to find out that there were civil service workers who had served for decades but had never received any recognition. That's because the civil service doesn't have access to the kinds of rewards that we offer in the private sector. So I did a very simple thing. For the holidays in 2011, I ordered an embossed chocolate coin for each of the 3,200 New York State Thruway associates and employees. I sent it with holiday greetings from me as chairman. And one day I passed the desk of one of our longtime employees. I noticed she hadn't eaten her chocolate, and she had it pinned up on the board. And I asked her why. I was concerned it was getting stale. She said because she wanted to keep it and look at it, because it was the first time in 40 years that anyone had given her any recognition at all. Meaningful progress requires constant vigilance. You have to ask questions, demand answers, and reject business as usual. Right from the beginning, our focus was on total time and total cost. So one of my first questions was, why does the Tappan Zee Bridge have to be located where the Hudson River spans through more than 3 miles across? Why can't we build a new bridge in a different location where the river is only a mile or so? Well, the Regional Plan Association gave me a good history lesson and all the reasons, both good and bad. The bridge is where it is, and we had to go with that, and we would have to follow the same way. Lesson 5, time is, let's see. Seem to be skipping some of these lessons, but you'll get the idea. Lesson 5, time is money. In infrastructure projects, keep the process moving in order to save money and avoid delays. As a builder and developer, I knew that risk increases exponentially with time. A failure to apply a business-like discipline to civic affairs, a failure to dig in, understand a problem, and resolve it, all of these could cost the communities around us in very real ways. We used high technology and analytics to address high accident locations to improve public safety. We moved to an all-electronic toll system. This improved productivity and the driver experience while reducing congestion in metropolitan areas. So you now see those tolls where there's no toll booths and just an electronic record of who passed by when they manage to find you if you haven't bought your Easy Pass. In partnership with Cornell University, we discovered innovative nano-based resurfacing materials that can extend the life of our roads, in this case up to 10 times. This nanoclay, now being field tested, has the potential to save New York State and the nation billions of dollars in repair costs annually. We engaged local schools in the Rockland area, hoping to inspire the next generation of civil engineers, infrastructure planners, and those who will devote themselves to civic responsibility. Lesson 6, get a long warranty from your builders. A lot of you are aware that the New York State Thruway Authority is suing the builders of the new bridge to pay for retrofitting 61 of the 992 cables that support the span. The procurement was obtained during my tenure as chair, but the construction took place after I left. It's possible that changes were made to the specs to which I would not have agreed, but the 100-year warranty we negotiated is in place to protect against just such problems. The innovations described in the case study are all well and good, but some of them required special legislation that has now expired, making the use of the others, such as nanoclay for road surfacing, require changing the specs in RFPs. RFPs are often wedded to old technologies and methods that decrease the life of infrastructure projects. But there are other issues as well. When it comes to a massive infusion of funds like the one we're seeing from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the pacing of projects is everything. The need is great, but the available of builders is limited. As an example, when it comes to bridges, there are many that need repair and rebuilding, but there are only a handful of qualified bridge builders available, and they're tied up in massive projects already. This is a matter of capacity to undertake the work that the funds are meant to cover. These are some of the issues that I hope the Innovation in Infrastructure program will tackle. The bipartisan infrastructure bill has given us a once-in-a-century opportunity. We count on the wisdom and guidance of those of you in this room today to ensure that we make the most of it. Thank you. So this is the Q&A. Oh, John is the Q person. I'm supposedly the A person.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Milstein, for sharing those invaluable insights with us. So let's just start at the beginning. So 2011, you were named as chairman of the Thruway Authority. You had experience in the private sector as a builder, but you never built a bridge, right? But the interesting thing was, nor had the Thruway Authority in the 50-plus years since the Tappan Zee Bridge. And so there was a loss of institutional capability. And so I'm wondering, just to situate us, what did your private sector experience prepare you for in your role as chairman? And then what did you have to learn about how government works along the way?
Well, there were lots of lessons along the way, not the least of which is I started out with an advantage in the lingo of construction. So when I met with all the competitors, I understood their frame of mind and what their objectives were and what their hot buttons would be. But the flip side of that was we ended up doing something that, to my knowledge, hasn't been done anywhere else, which was to get input from them. Because I had exactly that conversation with our engineering staff. And I said to them, you know, we've issued the specs, but, you know, these 4 bidding groups built all the bridges built in the world. And so they may know a little bit more about this than we do. And I could see a few people were a little uncomfortable with that. And I said, well, how many bridges have we built in the last 5 years? None. How many have we built in the last 10 years? None. And then we ended up finally getting to John's number of, in 5 decades or 6 decades, we never built a bridge. So they sort of were a little, they didn't want to let the fox into the hen house, so to speak. And they were a little leery of this. But I said, here's what I want to do. There was a 10-week bidding process. And I said, each week I want our senior engineering team to meet with the 4 competitors alone and ask them if there's any way to improve what we're doing. And they said, well, what are we going to do with that information? I said, well, what we do is if we can get all 4 competitors to agree on something, a change in the RFP that will benefit us in terms of value creation or extended life, we should consider it. And if all 4 agree, I mean, certainly each one will make some suggestion that plays into their strengths. But after taking that into account and neutralizing it by getting all the other 3 competitors, if that can be done, that's very useful. And there came a day when I got a phone call that said there's a crisis. I said, what's the crisis? Well, the second floor has not approved any toll increases, and so the second floor being the governor's office in Albany. So we didn't have any direction in Albany as to what they should do, because the contractors who were spending about $500,000 a week preparing their bid were saying they're going to stop work because there's nobody to pay for it. Now, it's true I had an ace in the hole in dealing with this, but I wasn't sure how it would work. So I called, and so I said to I had a monitor. I had the federal procurement person who knew the rule book of federal procurements, which, you know, got to keep it up and up. So I had him there, and I said I have to meet with the contractors. He said, well, you can't meet with the contractors. I said, why not? I said, if I don't meet with them, they've stopped working, we're not going to have a bridge. He said, well, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to tell them that they'll have the money. And I have some credibility in that area. They know me now. And so I met with them, and I said, you know, told them my experience in building and kind of things that they would be interested in. And after 2 sentences, they said, okay, we'll go back to work. So I, of course, did not miss an opportunity to again ask them, is there anything that we could be doing different to create more value in any of these aspects? And each one of them basically said the same thing, which is they were sure that we were going to get the best value that anybody ever got, because nobody ever asked them this question. And so the things they learn on all their projects don't get incorporated because it's too cumbersome to try to change the RFPs. And that, in fact, is what happened. And so I don't know if I'm skipping over too much of your question, but what ended up happening was the bridge that Governor Cuomo thought called me and said, we have to be able to do it within this budget of $5.4 billion. And I said, well, how am I supposed to figure that out? He said, well, you know about construction. So I called my friends, and they told me you got to get design build. Got design build. 11 months later, we gave out the contract, and it wasn't $5.4 billion. I called the governor back and said, we could do this for $4 billion or less. And he said, well, the U.S. Transportation Department thinks it's $5.4 billion. And the big dig in Boston, was supposed to cost $6 billion, but it's up to $28 billion. I just need to know that we can bring this in, you know, at some kind of budget. So you don't have to say $4 billion, as long as we could be $5.4 billion. I said, no, we could do it $4 billion or less. That's what I believe. He said, okay, go to work. So we did. We gave out the contract for $3.2 billion. So just think about this. So you have a person who's not experienced, to say the least, in bridge building or public contracting. That's 40% less. The time I did the calculation, 40% of the U.S. government budget was more than the amount of the deficit. So if we did, of course not everything is a bridge procurement, but if you had that kind of savings from asking these simple business questions, such as how can we improve on what we're doing, you could have dramatic results. Now, did I skip over anything?
Oh, no, that was great. Thank you, Mr. Milstein. I wonder, just for the edification of some of our guests, so how was design build different from the prevailing system used in New York, design bid build, and why did it yield such substantial savings?
So let me just say one name, Calatrava. For those who know, the system that exists separate normally in government is there's a contest, a beauty contest. So an architect puts together his dream, working with some engineers, of what the project should be. And after they decide exactly what it should look like, whether anybody has ever built anything that looks like this before, they then take that and they bid out, what does it cost to build this thing? Now, Calatrava built the downtown, designed a magnificent transit point for the PATH subways. Is that what it's? Yeah. And but it leaks. I think Frank Lloyd Wright had this problem quite a bit too. But yeah, so you're building things that no one has built before using what we call in the construction trade specials. In other words, actually a building that I built in New York had a provision that they wanted, the architects had designed acoustical ceiling tiles instead of 12-inch by 12-inch, 11.25-inch by 11.25-inch. So the off-the-shelf supply that happened to be an Italian producer had, the off-the-shelf thing, we couldn't use that, no. Had to use the other thing. And the way this happened to me is I had partners who had given out this contract because the architect was somehow socially engaged with them or someone's son-in-law. And of course, I never imagined they'd be designing 11.25-inch tiles. Well, I talked about time increasing risk exponentially. Now, think of the possibilities. It's an Italian manufacturer. It's a special. What has happened? It's in Italy. A strike. How long did the strike? So we couldn't finish the lobby of the building for over a year after it was open because we couldn't get the the right tile. So I think there's that. Have we covered the topic?
Yes, thank you. Didn't even work out with the centimeters to inches difference with the Italians.
That if it had arrived, then it had been the wrong size because of the center. That could have happened.
Another year.
That's one thing that didn't happen.
Thank goodness. Well, so on the one hand, you say that you've had to work with lots of folks in government who you found diligent and capable, but then you also had to work with many of the design builders' employees as well. So could you talk to us about how those interactions went and how you approached those differently, you know, those under your department and those who are working for you?
Okay, so I interrupted my own train of thought in discussing this issue as to who I dealt with. So my monitor, my federal monitor, said you cannot meet these people because if you do, you cannot vote on the project. I said, well, if I don't meet with these people, we'll have no bridge, so we won't have to worry about any vote on the project. And so I'm pretty confident that my board will follow along and do what makes sense. But keep in mind, I'm giving these people my assurance, my personal assurance, that this will be a real project that we'll get paid for and have money for. So that was the only meeting I had, personally, with the contractors, and all four were present. But they did meet with our engineering staff. regularly. There were 4 meetings every week. And I would get, kind of summaries of those meetings. So I kept track of it, but it was done by our people who were there. They knew how to do it. All they just needed was, okay, should we do that? Yeah. In fact, the question of should we do it is a very big question in public contracting. And in my remarks, I think I may have touched on fixing problems in the as they develop or they are found in accidents being occurred by perhaps the design of the road. Perhaps at a certain time of day, the sun is going directly into their eyes. And I became aware of this because, when I became chairman of the Thruway Authority, I had friends who got stuck in traffic on exit 18 coming into New York, and they had nothing to do, so they would call me and say, there's a delay here. And I got enough of those things. I saw that there was basically a delay on exit 18 from an accident every day. And luckily I didn't have too many friends. But I heard it enough to figure out, well, we should do something. So I would gather once a month my entire senior staff to talk about things they were doing, things that they, were stumped by, anything they wanted to talk about. So I laid out, gave them this example of the sun being, I said, maybe it's the way the lane feeds into the merge lane, and maybe it's a physical condition. And they said, they asked me a question that I wasn't sure why they were asking. They said, well, would you do something about it if you found out it was a physical problem? I said, of course. I said, if it's something that could be done for $1 million or less, we'll just do it right away. I mean, keep in mind, this is something that's listed causing accidents and deaths. And so I'll do that. If it's going to be, 50 or 100 million, we'll have to put it into our capital budget and have to go through a process, but we'll start to cure the problem. They said we're very relieved because we didn't want to have the answer to this question and not do it. It would create legal liability for us. So I said, no, we'll do it. And so that's my dealing, how I dealt with, I really, except for that one meeting I had, I dealt through my staff, through the senior people, who were all talented. It's not like these people didn't know their business. They absolutely knew their business. At one board meeting, this is all on tape because it's, public meetings, the fellow said to me, the fellow who was responsible for converting the toll booths into drive-throughs. So think of it, every car has to stop. Some have exact change, some have to get change, some drop their credit card on the floor. It's primitive. That's not what we want to have. People can go 55 miles an hour and not stop. I said, can you imagine the millions of man hours that you'd be saving? So in front of the public, the fellow responsible for this project, I said to him, how long is it going to take for us to replace all the tolls that we have with the drive-thrus? He said, 5 years. I said, if it takes 5 years, you're not going to be here. I literally said that. He said, don't worry, I just thought it was an outside date. I said, okay, as long as it's very far outside. So, you have to have a certain amount of drive to do better. Seems like the most basic kind of an idea, but in the public sector, the risk of having done something wrong puts a lot of things, at least in the delay lane, if not in the can't do it lane.
Right. And that's why it's so critical to have motivated your staff to want to be there, to have that morale that they're making an impact and they're doing good, important work.
I'll give you another example. So one of these sessions, our trucks, they said we have to replace our entire truck fleet. I said, why? And they said, well, because they're all Mack trucks. They're built to last forever, but they don't make them anymore, and they don't make any replacements for them anymore. So I said, what do you recommend? They said, we sell our existing ones and let somebody else deal with them. and get new ones. I said, will the new ones be as good as the old ones? They said, no, they won't be as good as the old ones. I said, well, why don't we do this? Since everybody is getting the same recommendation you're giving me, why don't we go into the aftermarket and buy up all the Mack trucks that are, just with a little fixing could be fixed, and just use them as a spare parts inventory. So these are the kinds of things that don't require any thought in the private sector. But they, when they heard about that, they said, oh yeah, that's a great idea. But I think that they're so beaten down by the process that they can barely do the things they must do. And so, but I think that all those people, and there were about, in those days, sitting around the room, maybe as many as 20, now know that type of thinking is a whole different thing. It's not hard to implement once you are familiar with it.
Right. And simply asking, are the new trucks better than the old trucks? I imagine that many folks who, would not ask to think that question, right? If the procedure is simply, well, we need new trucks, right? Now, on the theme of public value, what's remarkable about the Tappan Zee Bridge is that it was spared from the egregious costs, overages, and the delays that affect New York's transit and New York's infrastructure projects. How did the contract incentivize the design builder to get the job done on time and deliver that public value?
Now, this is an elaboration of one of your other questions that you mentioned that I didn't get to the answer. So let's see, where do I begin on this one? How do we make a start? Okay, so the essence of design build is you're going to avoid a dispute between the architect and engineer. The architect saying, we can't build what the engineer designed, or the engineer says we can't build what the architect designed. And if we go back to the Calatrava example, that certainly was the case, that they both blamed each other. The engineer said, or the architect said, you didn't install it properly. So you have to start with eliminating this. The fellow who you're thinking you owes you money, no, it's the other fellow. And then there's a whole battle. And then they end up with the public authority because it has to work, has to basically pay more than it should for other people's mistakes. So if you want to avoid that, what you do is you build it into the contract that you've got a team that's bidding. It's not just an architect who, when someone wins a beauty contest and then someone tries to, get a contract to build it this is before they have any budget. But so you can see that what's wrong with that system, and it leads to architects, more so than engineers, but architects and engineers designing things without reference to how much they cost. Well, what do you think the result has to be? It has to be $5 billion instead of $3 billion. So it's just, and it's basically been done that way for, 100 years. So that's really that's how you bring financial accountability to it, is you make the bidding group responsible financially. So in other words, the person who's designing it has to consult with the person who's going to build it, so that they end up saying, well, that'll cost too much because of X, Y, and Z, and it's not, it's nice, but we don't really need it. So in design, they're reducing costs.
Right, and you can't go and blame Calatrava for something that might be the construction company's mistake instead. So, yeah, on a similar theme, disputes are bound to come up in multi-billion-dollar projects. There was some back and forth on the Tappan Zee Bridge construction after your departure. As you mentioned, the sleeves for the cable anchors, some other disputes for bolts and for change orders. How did the contract anticipate this? It does have a dispute resolution mechanism built in, which is currently being utilized.
Which is an arbitration process.
Correct.
Or a legal process.
Correct.
So all of this is taken into account by having design build and a long guarantee of the work. So you've got this, the owner, in this case the public authority, and the contractors have a different interest. So the contractors, if you've done a good job with them in buying it, are basically not going to make a lot of money on that base contract price. But they're very good at saying, oh, well, this is your fault, or this has to, but this wasn't included, except it was included. But if they can say it's not included, then they have a dispute, and then it has to get resolved, and they can get some more money out of it. So you have to understand the mentality. So that's what they're going to do in every case. We know that when they start out.
Right, it's gravy they're going to angle for.
Right,
Yeah.
and so, you know, a certain minor amount of this is, you know, not the end of the world. But, you know, I think that there was I think that the Thruway Authority, or the Bridge Authority now, determined that of nearly 200 cables that hold up the bridge, that 60 or 90 of them would not last the full 100 years. In other words, there's nothing wrong with them now, but they're not going to last. And so the authority went on offense and said, we want you to pay us now for the fact that it's not going to last as much as, of course, the easy comment to say is, well, let's see. And then they say, well, if the way we see is some cables dump cars into the Hudson, that's not going to work. Now, I don't know the details of the arbitration, but the authority is on very strong ground. But there's lots of things that happen that you would be amazed happen. So at one point, I got I'll give you an example of that. At one point, I got a call from our Buffalo office, and I was trying to take the board to each of our central offices all over the state. And they said they had to spend $160 million resurfacing a road. So I said, okay, let's have our next meeting in Buffalo, and we'll go take a look at the road. I said, this is not something you just say, okay, now we're spending $160 million. So we go there, and we've got our state police with their special hats, and and they've stopped all traffic because the chairman of the Thruway Authority is there, and I keep saying, don't stop the traffic for me. No, all this traffic has to be stopped, and I'm walking and I'm looking at the road.
Seems counterproductive to do that, right? I mean...
So I'm looking at the road, and it's got little tiny cracks in it and a little tar in the cracks, and it's flat. There's no potholes or anything like that. So I said to the fellow in charge of the Buffalo office, I said, have we been getting many complaints about this? And he says, no. I said, well, how many have we had? He says, none. I said, so why are we, who wants this? The contractors. I said, well, of course the contractors want it, but the contractors are so friendly with the people who are running the office that that's a good enough, oh, they want it. That's a good enough idea. But of course, it's really not a good enough idea, and we didn't add that to the capital project plan.
So before we open it up to audience Q&A, I'm wondering what you see as opportunities, right? We know that there's going to be a new incoming administration, different from the old. You've mentioned there are advances in material science that could be brought to bear, but for some legislative changes. What do you see as some of the future possibilities in the space to bring innovation and infrastructure to life?
Well, I'll give you a bit of good news, and then I'll give you less good news. I'm not going to call it bad news, but it's definitely less good. The good news is I was in one of my meetings with the 20 people, one of my monthly meetings, and I said, you know, the way we handle our roads is not helpful to extending the life of the roads. So we've got this stuff that we've been doing since the 1950s, which is we put down new asphalt or concrete, and we put it down, and then we put salt on it, which deteriorates it, and the snow and the cold and the contraction, and that makes it weaker, and that makes it, and then in the winter, after they put all the salt on everything, they take the snow plows out and they gouge the surface, and so every summer they fill in the potholes caused by our own gouging. I said, there's got to be a way that's you know, have we ever investigated nanotechnology? So I'm a Cornell trustee, so we have this, you know, school of nanotechnology. I don't know if it's a whole school, but we have a building. And so I said, why don't we just ask them to do something? And they said, well, we don't have a budget for that. I said, well, that's okay, I'll pay for it. So I have my, one of my foundations organized to pay whatever the cost is. I was helping my alma mater anyway. So,
Good value.
yeah, so it's value all around. So he does this work, you know, nanotechnology, that's operating at the microscopic level of interactions between different chemicals and conditions. And so I said, let's find something that if you put it into the asphalt or the concrete, if you put it in there, and you put it in a cold environment, and a moist cold environment, and a salty cold environment, it gets stronger instead of getting weaker. They said, well, how would that work? I said, I don't know, you're the nanotechnology people, let's see if we can find something here. And lo and behold, now engineers think of the world in terms of strength and flexibility. Those are the two characteristics that substances could have. I learned all this through, so I don't know that much about it. But anyway, he said that one of them, on one of the metrics, it could last 5 times as long. And on the other metric, it could last 2 times as long. So I said, does that mean I multiply the 5 by the 2? He said, theoretically, yes. If you could produce, if you put in the substance that we found, that costs very little, you could extend the life of the asphalt by 10 times. So think of the interstate system, and you could make, if the interstate system lasted 10 times as long, the annual cost would be 1/10 of the cost of the interstate system. So that's currently being tested, and we had to move this forward a few different times, but yeah, that's still going on now, so it's 10 years later. But at least it's going on. Okay, so that's the good news. The bad news is, think of the electrical vehicle program, the whole program. The whole program, in retrospect, was not thought through very well, which is why American consumers don't want electric vehicles. So no one said, well, what if the dogs won't eat the dog food? What happens then? And what happens is a problem. So various American electrical vehicle manufacturers have said they're closed down. Ford lost $5 billion trying to have electric vehicles. And on distributors' lots all over America, there's a lot of electric vehicles. So the thought got past the reality. So wouldn't it be nice if we could have electric vehicles? Oh yeah, that would be great. But except the consumers don't think that. And they've got to buy. The dogs have to eat the dog food, otherwise it's no good. So that same type of thinking skipped over the problem that when we built the Tappan Zee Bridge, there were 4 consortia on the planet that were qualified to bid on this. All 4 bid. Maybe there were another 2 or 3 somewhere, but they somehow didn't want to bid. Well, okay, if that's what's going to happen, that there's only 4 to build this one project, how many projects could, in our case, Fluor Corp, as the lead contracting entity, how many bridges of this magnitude could Fluor Corp do at the same time? 3, 4? How many? Well, if you divide the amount of money available for infrastructure by the number of projects, you're talking 30,000 projects. Well, are there 30,000 contractors? He's not doing them all at the same time. In fact, there's no hope of doing all these simultaneously in parallel, or even anything remotely like it. So much worse than that, when the states finally get around to saying this is the project we want, okay, well there's 49 other states who are all saying that same thing. So we want to get it at a low price, so we want the contractors hungry for work. We don't want them saying, well, if you don't give me my price, I'll go to the state next door and get it. So the whole way it could be procured was not taken into account. The limitations of the pipeline were never taken into account. And it's just like, okay, we're going to build, X, except that the capacity in the country is, 1/100th of X. I mean, not even 1/10 of X. So maybe that's not actually the thing holding it up now, but that's one of the reasons why the electrical vehicle, 500 of them have not been built, or 492 have not been built. The other 8 have been built.
And just underscores the reason why productivity is so important. If we have so few contractors to fulfill this great demand, well, productivity can help us do that better. That anecdote reminds me of, President Obama's shovel-ready jobs. Remember that? Except that there's no such thing. Right? He just couldn't. It didn't exist.
Well, President Obama came to an opening, a ribbon cutting for the. It was before the ribbon, maybe it was the start of the construction. And he said this is the largest infrastructure project in the nation. But, it goes back, there's a long tradition of contractors and public officials. It's the famous case of a mayor of New York who was being attacked by the press because he was giving all the contracts to his brother-in-law. And so...
Not Mayor Adams.
No, and when this was 100 years ago, or 140 years ago. And when they asked him, well, why are you doing this? He said, what's the point of being mayor if you can't give your brother-in-law contracts? That's a true story.
Well, hopefully we're looking for other reasons to be interested in infrastructure projects. Thank you, Mr. Milstein. Let's open it up to some Q&A. Thank you.
In the back row.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the remarks and the interview, and I took the liberty of reading the case study, and there's a bunch of questions, some of which have been asked, but I want to zero in on something that you didn't mention in your lessons learned. I have a technology background, and these are huge capital-intensive processes, and even back in 2011, there were things like simulation software, building digital models, so you could test the optionality.
CAD-CAM.
Exactly, CAD-CAM, CAE. And so I was like asking you, was that a minor support role or a partnership in the way you decided to assess risk and trial different ways of both building and materials you use for construct? Is that incidental or central?
So it wasn't central to me. In fact, I'm not aware whether we used CAD-CAM in our engineering department. It seems to me we probably did. But for sure, the bidders all used it. So that was available, that knowledge was available, as you say, at that time, and it was pretty, well known. It wasn't in its infancy. It was well developed, and new generations of CAD-CAM are even better than we started with.
But your folks didn't review their submissions in that account?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, they may well have, but it's just no one ever mentioned it to me.
Other questions, please. Yes. In the aisle, I think there was a question. Yes, sir. Thank you.
You mentioned,
Yeah, you have to just be very close to it.
okay.
Kiss it.
All right. I'm concerned with the fact that some wonderful ideas in construction efficiency, safety, and speed can be compromised if we don't keep in check certain institutions. I remember reading a few years ago Phil Plotch's book on the Second Avenue subway, and he noted that when Barcelona was building their subway, they had a tunnel machine, a wonderful machine, which worked very well, and it was operated by 7 employees. We have the same machine here, and it required 25 employees.
25 union employees.
Okay, I stand corrected, 25 union employees. So you obviously know my concern about institutions. To me, the government should be very much involved in making sure that these kinds of problems are kept in check, because there's no free lunch, as you've noted many times. So I don't know how to get around these. Perhaps more exposure by people such as yourself, press, academia, Manhattan Institute will help, but it just shouldn't be allowed to be business as usual.
If I can just start off by saying, this is one of the goals of the Milstein Innovation and Infrastructure projects at the Manhattan Institute. We want to raise the salience of infrastructure so that ordinary citizens know what they're not getting. Know that, you know, the extraordinary costs of New York's infrastructure, for example, means that they're not getting the subways, they're not getting the public parks, they're not getting the public goods that they deserve with their hard-earned tax dollars. And so we want to not only propose solutions to these problems, but also to put some public pressure to bear on our elected leaders who have simply allowed the status quo to continue for so many years unchecked, to the detriment of the public interest. And if Tuesday's elections meant anything, it meant a widespread dissatisfaction among many urbanites with the way that things have been run for far too long. Infrastructure, public safety are just two of many examples where we've dropped the ball in places like New York, and in many cases it's because of the special interest influences that dominate our politics, right? And so what are we to do to push back? Well, we're trying to do something at the Manhattan Institute, and this is the start of a years-long initiative, thanks to Mr. Milstein's support and to our generous donors, that hopes to move the needle in a positive and constructive direction, particularly now that we have a new presidential administration. Would you like to add anything to that?
No. You have to come back for the next lecture.
Yes, thank you. We have time for one more? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Milstein. So we've got a lot of government investment in infrastructure coming in over the last 4 years, most of it unspent. We'll see to the extent that it's clawed back or not. But the new president-elect spoke during his campaign about $6 billion being spent on charging stations for those electric cars that nobody wants to buy, to build, 10 stations, and of course the man's given to hyperbole, but he is right, and other infrastructure projects like spending tens of billions of dollars to hook up rural houses to Wi-Fi, and none of them have been connected. It could have been done with Starlink. I was speaking with John recently, and he mentioned that there hasn't been a confirmed federal procurement officer in the OMB throughout the entire history of the Biden administration.
Yeah. He's the last, Dr. Wooten is the last serving one, yes.
The eminent last serving one, Dr. Wooten with us. How do we systematize the successes that you had at the state level on the much grander and more obstinate federal level, do you think is, one or two things that we could eat the elephant one bite at a time, if you will?
Well, this gives me an opportunity to push one of my pet projects, which is called Required National Service. And it's not obvious, let me just say how these things are connected. So the battle lines are drawn. A lot of money is going to get spent. There are some people who could get that money or get more of it. They want to do that. So you've got the political entities, the private sector, you've got the public sector. So the public sector, in just general, just because it's not spending their own money, they're spending the public's money, are not going to be quite as careful on average as someone who's spending their own money. So you get this problem of how are you going to change that dynamic of there's the people who have a lot of money to spend and the people who are not particularly scrupulous at times, wanting to get more of it. So the only way to deal with this that I can think of is for Americans to have a sense of their responsibility as citizens. And that would solve a lot of other problems also that we have. But anyway, just on this one topic, Well, I mean, I could say, well, you get a businessman who's, understands this situation, but, that would be like, I don't know, 20,000 businessmen taking a year or two off from their thing. But they have to be honest. And there's human nature is getting in the way of some of this. Unfortunate. But I think if you're thinking about this realistically, you have to realize that that's a problem. And, it was my greatest joy to be able to do things better. That's for the public. But not everybody thinks that way. So, I think that's the problem. And so, but a long-term solution would be building in civic responsibility and other things as the norm, where there's no norm like that now. There's, I don't know, stuff out there, but not organized.
Which underscores the importance of bringing in dedicated, experienced folks from the private sector into government service to bring that wealth of knowledge and expertise that may not be present in institutional capacity. So with that, is there one more question? I think we have. But with that, I want to thank you, Mr. Milstein, for your public service and the dedication you brought, the focus on public value. I'm sure many of you, probably all of you, have driven across the Tappan Zee Bridge, now the Mario M. Cuomo Bridge, but after today, I think you might not ever see it the same way ever again. And we have Mr. Milstein, his team, and the good public servants that worked for him and after him to thank for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So our next series of presentations will be by our authors who have published their Milstein Innovation and Infrastructure papers today, and we will recommence very shortly. Thank you.
Which is this one I found out when I did mine. So, when my officer says to me, "We want to do a WAPO." I said, "What's a WAPO?" A WAPO is best in final all. I said, "Well, let's think about it." So we got this bid for $700 million. Lower than but how long will it take? Probably about 3 months. So I said, what happens if the stock market tradition between now and then? It'll cost us $700 million more. So I said, then he said, oh, but the natural thing
we might just award the contract without battle. Don't plan it. And that's pretty much just going to Jumps right out. I'm trying to remember where we were. Oh yeah, he's actually in the main office. He's a career person. Yeah, he's
I just want to say before we leave, I gave a picture with you. You'd appreciate it.
Oh.
That's
Leslie Field is the boss there. Yeah, he works with Leslie. Yeah, Matt Long. So yeah,
Ladies and gentlemen, our program will resume shortly. Again, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our program will resume shortly.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're about to begin the next segment of our program this afternoon, which is to highlight the 3 papers of the Milstein Innovation and Infrastructure Project at the Manhattan Institute, 2 of which were published today. The first of which we will now hear from the 2 authors. I encourage you to grab a copy and to read it at your leisure. And so I'm delighted to introduce our next speakers. Dr. Stephen Polzin, who will speak first, is a civil engineer and research professor at Arizona State University's School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment. Prior to joining ASU, Dr. Polzin served as a senior advisor for research and technology in the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Research and Technology at the U.S. Department of Transportation. He previously served as Director for Mobility Policy Research at the University of South Florida, preceded by positions in major metropolitan transit agencies in Chicago, Cleveland, and Dallas. He has served on the boards of directors of a transit authority and a metropolitan planning organization and participates in numerous professional associations. Kirk T. Steidl is the president of Steidl Executive Group, and he is an independent national consultant. Previously, he served as director of Michigan's Department of Transportation from 2006 until 2018, spanning 2 gubernatorial administrations, where he oversaw the state's 10,000 miles of highways and 4,000 highway bridges. During his tenure, he spearheaded the department's first public-private partnership and he assisted the University of Michigan's research efforts on autonomous vehicles. He has received numerous national honors from the National Academy of Science and the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, and additional international recognition from the International Road Federation. Secretary Steidl and Dr. Polzin will be speaking to us about the challenges facing the U.S. transportation sector and what leaders and policymakers should consider when making transportation decisions. And I welcome you to the lectern. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and you greeted me with very nice southern weather for the occasion as well. Let's see if we're okay. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about where we're at in transportation today. Some of the reasons that it's so much fun to continue my career, having flunked a couple retirements, is that it's the most exciting time in the last 50 years for transportation. We're at a period of dramatic change in several aspects of transportation that are unprecedented historically. Some neat opportunities, but certainly some compelling challenges that are facing us at this particular area. Again, dynamic changes. On the technology side is perhaps the most significant factor that's influencing that. and particularly the communications and computerization technologies, things like telework that have dramatically impacted travel behavior, the logistics implications, the online capability to do things like fare payment, the ability to do things like ride-hail services through computer apps, dramatic changes in transportation. Those spill over into things like energy efficiency and safety, new materials for construction, et cetera. And that really changes all of the technology capabilities of the modes and their features and attributes, and accordingly, both the business models and the behaviors of the public as it relates to delivering transportation. In addition to that, we've got changes in culture and demographics that are occurring simultaneously. People are moving and changing. We're a much more diverse population than we were. The financial capacities of geography are changing quickly, and the transportation needs with them. We're simultaneously seeing some significant changes in the values that are influencing transportation decision-making. As over the years, as we've learned more about transportation, we've recognized that it impacts virtually all aspects of life, from happiness and personal health to certainly the environment. And because we now understand the full breadth of impacts of transportation, we're changing how we plan and how we make decisions. We're integrating all that new information into decision making. And complicit with that, we now have a much more partisan environment for decision making for transportation than has historically been the case. The consequence of these rapid changes in several factors mean decisions are far more complex than has historically been the case. They're more contentious and controversial than has historically been the case. And there's a great deal more uncertainty, not only because of the changes we've seen, but by the prospect of continuing changes over time, things like electrification, automation, et cetera, that will continue to influence changes over time. One of the kind of fundamental things that we want to speak to here is the fact that the foundational motivation for transportation has been to provide the mobility that's critical to the quality of life. And sometimes we forget that, and this piece coming from the Global Competitiveness Report in 2019 really encapsulates that. It says enhancing competitiveness is still the key for improving living standards. Sustained economic growth remains a critical pathway out of poverty and a core driver of human development. In fact, there is overwhelming evidence that the growth has been the most effective way to lift people out of poverty and improve the quality of their lives. So we think it's critical to recognize that that attribute of transportation can't get lost amidst all of the other aspirations and goals that people are layering on top of transportation. Just to give a little bit of context on that, right now, transportation is about 15% of household spending. Interestingly, the New York is below the national average on that quite significantly. But in the next line, you'll see that the average person spends about an hour a day in travel. The New York number on that is going to be above the national average. Less money, more time in travel in this particular region. It's about 29% of greenhouse gas emissions, obviously a significant share of energy use, a critical factor in safety. Historically, accident fatalities have been amongst the highest, or the single largest cause of fatalities, particularly amongst young people, children, for example. Big influence on land use. So it's certainly critical to the whole economy and the functioning of society. And unlike some other aspects of society, transportation affects literally everybody. Even if you yourself don't travel, all of the materials that built the dwelling units, that serve the dwelling units, the supplies, the materials, the foods, the waste materials that are transported away, all of that comes by transportation. So it's foundational to literally everybody in society. there's a couple elements of transportation that sometimes we forget. Mobility enables economy of scales, and that's how transportation influences productivity and growth, and mobility enables agglomeration economies. The New York area is certainly an example of that. The ability of corporate headquarters and others to attract talent and have innovation and communication and leverage the personal skills and capabilities to their best end that are enabled by having a mobile, accessible transportation system. From a practical business perspective, that means access to workers, access to jobs, to suppliers, and to customers. Those are the things that make the economy successful. This is an interesting graphic. It shows the average commute time for individuals on a one-way work trip commute in various countries. This is data collected by European sources, the ODEC group over there. It's 2015 numbers, but it's a little surprising because oftentimes Americans fantasize or aspire to be just like some other city across the world. I traveled this place and it was great. Why aren't we just like them? And yet you can see on this graph, we're the second bar here. We've got amongst the second lowest in this case, average commute time of all of these global economies. While this reflects commuting, the fact of the matter is that layers over into everything else. It means we have high levels of mobility and accessibility in this country relative to other places across the globe. That's been foundational to allow us to have the strong and competitive climate that we do have. Complicated governance and competing conflicting goals is the next section of the paper, and this speaks to understanding the complexity of what's going on, and as I referenced, as we begin to understand the full aspects of transportation, we recognize that we're moving beyond what historically, if you go back a few generations, there was a strong political consensus on transportation. It was very bipartisan. We focused on accessibility, safety, and affordability. It was kind of straightforward. Now, all of a sudden, we're layering all of these other factors in on top of that, making it a far more complex set of decisions that we have to make. Certainly, the ones that have been very high profile recently are obviously carbon footprint, environmental impacts, to some extent sensitivity to health and the relationship to activity levels, health and land use, and also equity has been a huge factor that's driving a lot of activity and interest within transportation. In addition to that, we're starting to pay attention to things like sustainability, resilience, flexibility, adaptability of our investments in the context of change, the leveraging of innovation, et cetera. We've looked at governance structures. One of the first things that people do when they find some frustrations with transportation is they think, well, if we change the structure of government, we can fix that. And there's a fairly significant body of literature looking at governance, but the thing that's important to realize is that there's literally hardly any common models of governance of transportation across the different levels. There's so much diversity across the country in the structure, in the geography, in the governance style. For example, some states own a huge share of the roads and own and operate the public transit. In other states, you've got a multitude of other agencies and local governments doing those same things. You've got geographies like New York where you coordinate across multiple states. Oftentimes you've got special governments and authorities for things like ports and toll roads and airports, et cetera. Extremely complex and hard to define what's good, what's best, et cetera. Multiple players. The challenge that we've come to that relates to the bureaucracy and the pace of decision making is that this very complex environment with projects that almost always involve multiple stakeholders means that decision making gets very, very challenging. Each of these authorities ends up with significant leverage in those decisions, and they can use that leverage to influence the decisions, often extracting attributes and characteristics of the investments that complement their own personal preferences and aspirations, and of course have impacts on schedule and budget as we weave our way through that decision-making process. One of the big challenges that we face going forward as it relates to productivity is the inherent conflict between market-driven, mobility-driven goals versus equity-driven goals. And that's one that I don't think, as a professional, has been given enough attention in terms of what is the consequence, what's the nature of the trade-offs, and what are the implications, particularly for private sector participation in providing transportation, if all of a sudden we layer all kinds of equity considerations on top of market and productivity considerations. Not that these aren't important and legitimate objectives, but it makes it very challenging and impacts potentially the productivity of transportation. And we do have a culture where there's a mindset in some cases of prescribing the future versus predicting and responding to the future. And there's some conflict within the profession and amongst the policymakers as to what in fact is the right role. And I see that regularly across the profession. There's a couple of takeaways from this issue of governance. Transportation leadership requires attention. Again, almost as a credit to the industry, historically, transportation has functioned fairly well with a strong professional workforce and a shared bipartisan agenda, but those days are behind us. It's more complex now, and it's going to require time and attention from management and from political leadership to have a path forward that works. Administrative processes require reform. That's been alluded to in the prior talk. I won't get into details on that. Context matters. Historically, the country was a lot more homogeneous with commonality across areas. Growth was relatively uniform across the country. Right now, we've got somewhere between a third and a half of the counties that have been in decade-long declines in population. We've got very different political, in fact, we're getting more politically polarized historically than we have been. Very different issues in terms of climate, weather, growth, politics, political willingness to accept things like funding and use of modes. Even if you look at deployment of electric vehicles, for example, there's very significant variance across the states in acceptance and use of those options. There's no easy answers. It would be fun to be able to tell you if we only did X, Y, and Z, we could fix this. We can't. It's complex. They're tough issues. They're going to take time and attention to address. And any structure of governance doesn't completely insulate you. You need integrity, leadership, and competence, and we need that in transportation. I used to jokingly tell folks that the DOT secretary position was often the last cabinet position filled in administrations, and that was the one that when you had to fill in a slot of what was left on your, we need someone from the other party or a different part of the country or diversity or something else, we use that position to fill that in because it wasn't simply, it didn't raise to the stature and the importance of some of the other cabinet positions. I would argue that it's a more important function now and a critical function. And I'll let Kurt talk a little bit here about some of the funding challenges.
Thanks, Steve. So I'll talk briefly here about the funding and what's coming forward here. So you take a look at this chart, the big green spike, that's the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and the purple line is the Congressional Budget Office kind of expectation. Now take that big green piece and drop it right in about there. But in September of 2026, the reauthorization for the Highway Trust Fund ends. So there have to be some reauthorizations. Lots of people are saying we're going to go back to what it used to be. Well, that's not going to work. Inflation has already taken up about 50% of the available spending, 50 to 60%, and you take this piece, this once-in-a-lifetime investment, is not going to be once in a lifetime. The reality is it's going to need to be a continual investment all the way through going out into here. There is plenty more to do. So if you look at the federal share, it's easy to think that across the country, the federal government pays for most of the infrastructure. They don't. 26% in 2010, dropped to 22.7% in 2019. That big green bar pushed it back up to about the 26%, but that's going to drop off. So the reality is 75% or more is being funded by state and local government, toll roads and the like. So as we think about what's the federal role in transportation, there certainly is a lot of discussion that says, well, we're kind of devolving the system. We built it, we're going to turn it back to states. I would suggest that we need to think really closely about that so that we don't unintentionally end up with a very disparate system across the country, particularly the interstate system. We need to take the federal government and focus it on national priorities. Specifically, as Steve talked about, economic competitiveness. What's going to make this country grow and grow faster? That's where we should be putting national investment dollars at. And at the same time, we got to identify new federal or new sources, whether it's at the federal level, the state level, the local level, or frankly, toll roads and private investments as well. So here's a few recommendations going forward. One, we need to have the federal levels determined. As Howard mentioned earlier, you need to know what that budget is. These planning cycles take a while, and you can't just drop in a bunch of shovel-ready projects and expect really significant projects to just come up overnight. The funding needs to be stable, needs to be predictable. Steve mentioned the user fees. We can't disconnect the user from the funding. Right now, you buy gas, you pay for a road. You work on a toll road, you pay a toll, goes to the toll road. When we start moving all this general fund money in, it becomes no different than any other category in the federal government. I mentioned the Highway Trust Fund. It's going to be impacted, one, by higher efficient fuel vehicles. I saw this in 2006 when the first hybrid Suburbans came out. I said, this is a big deal, right? Because fuel efficiencies are going to go from 10 to 20. That's a big deal. Electrification is going to have one, as well as inflation. At the end, Howard talked about it exactly right. We still have to internally control the efficiency, the costs, all of the internal expenditures with laser focus to make sure we're getting the best value for all of our dollars. So I'm going to turn it back to Steve to roll through here in the last minute and a half.
I just want to touch a little bit on the workforce. Of course, I've been involved in transportation education for a number of years. There is a workforce shortage across transportation. It certainly makes the contemporary news: air traffic controllers, truck drivers, bus drivers, inspectors, construction industry capacity, etc. And so that certainly poses a challenge to transportation. We also have the challenge that transportation, as I've alluded to, is much more complex, much more sophisticated. There's a lot of technology involved, a lot of data analysis and performance measurement involved. So you have to have a workforce with high skill levels in many capacities, and skill levels that sometimes require private sector compensation and career level investments that aren't conducive to use in the public sector historically. We certainly have some challenges and opportunities and some benefits. One of the things that we're fortunate of right now is the new things that are happening in transportation have energized the profession, and they've attracted all kinds of folks that historically, transportation was those city planners that civil engineers, and it was kind of boring, and we don't have TV shows about transportation planners like we do other professions. So we end up with nobody interested in it. But now when you've got things like automation and electrification and sensitivity to environment and other things like that, we're getting a much more diverse, much more multidisciplinary workforce, and that's a very positive sign. The challenge, of course, is that we need to find ways to bring those people up to speed, so to speak, and give them the transportation knowledge. And we need to do things like depart the wisdom and experience of Kirk to the next generation quickly, because we don't have adequate capacity in the workforce, and we're not going to be able to have everybody learn from experience, so we need to be able to share that experience to move ahead. And we may need to be innovative in terms of administration and personnel processes, and do things like accommodate telework and think about new career paths and find out how we can get supplemental education to people who don't have transportation education to give them the skills. And just as a final slide here, oftentimes, all of us have opinions about how we should address any one of these individual problems, but I guess the plea here is that the thing that we really need that's first and foremost is we need to pay attention to transportation and work through these. Too often we've had some of these issues that we've let fester for decades in some cases. We've had a transportation funding shortfall forever, and we've kicked the can down the road repeatedly. We've had workforce challenges for a long time. We've had problems with integrating public-private sector partnerships for long times. We know what the issues are. We need to make the time commitments to work through those issues, arguably in ways that are bipartisan so that they have sustainable long-term benefits moving forward. So with that, I'll surrender the mic here.
Terrific. Thank you, gentlemen, so very much for your insights and your expertise and experience. I'm now delighted to introduce our next speaker and author of yet another paper in the Milstein Innovation and Infrastructure Project, Dr. Judge Glock, my friend. He is a director of research and a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. He was formerly the senior director of policy and research at the Cicero Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Austin, Texas, and the visiting professor of economics at West Virginia University. He writes about the intersection of economics, finance, and housing with a perspective informed by his work, including his doctoral work in economic history. Dr. Glock will be discussing the diminishing returns to infrastructure investments and the need for policymakers to make strategic, targeted, and cost-effective infrastructure decisions at all levels of government. Thank you.
It's good to have a timer up. Us academics have a tendency to prolixity. We get infatuated with the sound of our own voice when you're talking to 18-year-olds all the time and nobody's responding. Do I press up here to move it? Here it is. Thank you very much. Okay, so the report I did today has what obviously I intended to be a somewhat provocative, and one might even say obnoxious title, considering the focus of this event. But I do hope to show that it is actually, I think, much more in line of what Mr. Milstein and the other presenters were trying to argue about the needs of the future of infrastructure and the current problems we face around it. I got it. There we go. So this may be common knowledge to a lot of people in the room right here, but I think it's worthwhile getting perspective on where we're at in terms of the funding. So maybe a little washed out right there, but if you look at the side, this is percent of gross domestic product we spend on what's known as core infrastructure, basically transportation and water. Transportation's about 2/3. Everyone's very familiar about it. With that, I often surprise people that water infrastructure is almost 1/3 of all of our core infrastructure spending. It does not get the press and attention as other spending, but it's actually a massive amount of what we're doing in terms of national and state and local infrastructure. And if you look at that top peak back in 1960 was around 3%, not so surprising, after the 1956 Eisenhower Interstate Highway Act. But since then, you've kind of seen national infrastructure spending bump around at about 2.5% of GDP for more or less decades. At the end of this graph in 2017, it's a little under 2.5%. Obviously, it jumped up past that after the bipartisan infrastructure law. So some people will look at a graph like this and say, we're not spending enough on infrastructure. Maybe they do that by comparing that with the very peak in 1960. Maybe they do that by comparing the U.S. to other countries that do spend, like China, which spends significantly more. To my mind, that's not necessarily intuitive or obvious, and I'm not sure that we can look at a sort of gross domestic product for spending and see, well, how much should we be spending on these core infrastructure programs? Now, to my mind, one of the surprising things about this is these two major programs we're talking about spending on are basically 2 centuries old at this point. This is not, for instance, spending largely on new railroads or airports or so forth. A lot of this is highways, and a lot of this is water infrastructure. This is asphalt, and asphalt's really, I guess, 1890s when they do it, but asphalt and pipes. With some treatment, of course. I'm not saying there hasn't been an immense amount of technological change in the basis of these infrastructure projects, but the basic infrastructure network we're building out isn't something new. This is not talking about fiber optic cable. This is not talking about even, electric wires. This is talking about your very core basic infrastructure that we've been building now for a century plus. Now, it's not intuitive to me either that we should necessarily always be spending a large or increasing amount of GDP on older network infrastructure. That's not to say we shouldn't be spending $0 on it, obviously, and I hope to make that clear over the course of my talk. But it's not clear to me that it necessarily should be an increasing or even a stable proportion of GDP like we see right here. So I show that we're spending, roundabouts the same amount of infrastructure spending as a proportion of GDP, which means we're spending more in real terms over the past 50, 60 years continuously on this core infrastructure. And again, maybe common knowledge to many people in the room, but that's not because we're facing some sort of infrastructure maintenance crisis or because we have ever-increasing maintenance needs that desperately need attention in the way they didn't, say, 40, 30 years ago. So the chart on the left is the percentage of highway bridges in poor or structurally deficient condition. Both the tops are rural, the bottom's urban. So you've seen more or less a decline of about half in the number of bridges in poor or structurally deficient shape. Now, one could correctly say we should have almost no bridges in structurally deficient shape or in poor condition, but this is definitely not a maintenance crisis as what some of the language around the bipartisan infrastructure bill would lead one to believe when they were donating or contributing tens of billions of new dollars into bridge maintenance, which they said used some examples like the famous Minneapolis bridge collapse to say we are having a crisis in bridge maintenance in the country. We are clearly not. We are continuously improving our bridge maintenance. Similar here, the percentage of roads in good conditions. That top line, the purple line, is in good condition. That's gradually but steadily increased over the past 22, 23 years, as it's continued to increase for decades now, basically. Yes, we should have better roads, but the problem with American roads right now isn't that they're in an unparalleledly bad maintenance position. They're continually getting better. So we have continuously increased real spending on infrastructure. We have improving infrastructure in terms of its basic maintenance and declining needs for maintenance due to that continual improvement. Now that we have that kind of background perspective, I want to spend the rest of my talk talking about what I think are the 3 major aspects of modern infrastructure spending that we all to some extent recognize, but to my mind, I think need to be related to each other. The first one is that we are having lower returns on new projects. Lower returns on new projects by a bunch of metrics have set in and are continuing to decrease as they have for decades now. This is consistent with the research on public capital in general. This is I think a World Bank or IMF report which says on public capital, the larger the stock, the better its quality, the lower will be the impact of additions to the stock. So when you have a substantial amount of highways, when you've built out the 40+ thousand miles of interstate highway system, the 41st thousand mile will not be as important as that first or the 20th or the 21st, and so forth. That makes sense. That's exactly what we've seen. In my report, I cite lots of evidence from an economist studying the returns to highways in terms of improved productivity, increased mobility, that those have been going down for decades. That the returns to the interstate highways in the 1960s, say, possibly contributed about a third of all productivity increases in the entire country. This was a massive boon to the American economy. And then by the 70s, it's decreasing, and by the 80s, you're having about 8% of productivity increases being attributed to new highways. And by that period, you're also having highways return around about what private capital is returning. So that's not to say that it's not a worthwhile investment. It's just saying the gross returns and the net returns are much lower than they were in the past. And here, perhaps the most egregious example, this is productivity and public transportation. That bottom yellow line is passenger trips. And if you look at that, it's almost unchanged for the past 50 plus years. We've had a pretty stable number of passengers riding public transit in America for almost 50 years. Yet the number of vehicle miles traveled, right up here, purple line, has been continuously increasing. So if you're having continuously increasing vehicle miles, pretty stable passenger miles, what's happening? The buses, the trains, et cetera, are being more and more empty. As we add more and more stock, more and more miles, those buses and trains are going to increasingly marginal places and are carrying fewer and fewer people, and perhaps even more surprising than that, they're doing it at a higher cost. The operating cost per trip, forget the operating cost per passenger mile, has gone up about 5 times since 1960. So getting that same bus is moving fewer and fewer people at a higher and higher cost, and then leading to an even increased higher and higher cost overall. Per trip, that's per individual passenger trip, partially because the cost of vehicle miles has been going up so much. So we're getting lower returns. We're building projects that aren't making the returns that we had in the past. Partially, that's just the nature of built-out systems, as I described before. The research on that is fairly consistent. And you can also see this in water and sewer prices. So most of this infrastructure we're talking about, and I'm glad the previous presenters talked about user fees, we're talking about things that are built specifically for the people who often paid for them either through gas taxes, through tolls, or in water and sewer, largely through their monthly water and sewer fees. Now, this is something I've become a bit of an obsessive about because it's kind of a mind-blowing statistic to me when you think about it. So talk about something that's basically 2 centuries old, piped water to your household. Ever since the 1840s, when the New York City created the Croton Aqueduct system, they've had some variation on this. So this is not a new network system. You'd expect just the natural technological evolution to improve the price of this system that's been built out for years. And yet here's the price, that top red line, is the consumer price paid for water and sewer. The price just since 2000, if you look at, compare it to real terms, the CPI, which has increased somewhat, it's about 50 to 100% higher. But if you drive it all the way back to 1980, which is 1982, when this is 100, and compare it to the change in consumer prices, you're having the price of the water and sewer getting into your house being about 3x what it was in 1980. Mind-blowing. People are basically turning on the tap and getting the same amount of water in the same basic way as their grandparents and their great-grandparents did, and even in the past 50 years, they're paying about 3 times as much for that. So, this is despite continuously building out more and more water infrastructure. It's not resulting, as I also show in the report, an increased use of water. Our water, in terms of public water to individuals, peaked about 20 plus years ago. It's been pretty stable. We're getting about the same amount of water, in fact, slightly decreased amount, and continuously higher prices. So we're having these lower returns on infrastructure. Now, one of the reasons for this, but not necessarily the same as this, is we're funding worse projects. Now, if you're funding a vehicle mile traveled out into the sticks in the middle of, say, rural Alabama, that's going to have a lot lower return than funding another mile in the middle of New York City or somewhere else. And obviously, increasingly, we're funding those increasingly marginal projects out in Alabama and so forth. We're building out the infrastructure in places that's not bringing the returns it did in the past. This on the left is something I'm embarrassed I've never seen. This is Virginia Transportation Museum. Obviously, we're the sort of people that like to go to transportation museums. So we're people that shouldn't really complain about this because we're always excited to see them. Maybe stop by the interstate and try to check some of these out. But since 1997, at least for a while there in the transportation enhancement programs, the federal government was paying for these out of the gas tax. Why should the federal government be paying for a transportation museum out of something that was specifically supposed to be for interstate infrastructure? Little hard to justify. Now, of course, this on the right is the Big Dig project. Famously, even before its cost overruns, the DOT estimated the real returns to this were at most about 50 cents on the dollar, that this was bringing incredible net negative returns. And it's not surprising, perhaps, that this is, by some measures, the very last funded project in the interstate highway system that started back in 1956. As the system was built out, they were going to increasingly marginal products that were increasingly politicized. This was, of course, partially a result of Tip O'Neill just putting his foot on the gas in the 1987 highway bill and making sure that went through. A lot of local government leaders wanted transportation museums to go up, so those politicized projects got through in a way they didn't in 1956. So we're having all of these increasingly bad projects that are being funded, both at the federal level and the local level. Now, the third most important aspect of infrastructure funding today that I think we all recognize is the increasing costs of infrastructure. Not to the consumers I'm talking about here, I'm talking about the cost to actually build this. Now, highway miles are often studied in this regard because they're one of the easiest to compare across time. Again, this is a fairly consistent product. There's new innovations and technologies that can happen, but basically those should, if anything, reduce the cost of highway mile highway mile built. The opposite happened. And you look at 1960, 1970, cost of building a highway mile, pretty stable. By the end of 1980, it's almost 2 times what it was in 1960, and even by 1990, we're about 4 times what it was. The costs are going up. You see these other lines that are showing, well, that doesn't seem necessarily to be the cost of the workers, it's not necessarily materials, not the hourly wage, just the gross cost of these is continuously going up over time. And if anything, it's more rapidly going up more recently. So you've seen reduced returns, you've seen worse and worse projects being funded, and you've seen increasing cost. A lot of these costs are coming from mandates, and a lot of these mandates are coming from the federal government. There's minority contracting requirements. If those of you who are aware, originally from 1977, I believe, the federal government said, we're trying to get at least 5% of all public works spending to minority contractors. They increased that to 15% under the Biden administration as a goal. They're coming close to hitting that. Of course, there's the National Environmental Policy Act, National Historic Preservation Act, new labor mandates. The federal government recently imposed a project labor agreement mandate on new projects across the United States. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, of course, increased the Buy America requirements, which were expanded far beyond what they were, again, that were imposed in the 1970s. So in fact, a lot of these requirements you look at right here were happening in the 1970s, exactly when the returns, as I described earlier, were going down, and the increasingly bad funded projects were going up. So you have this ironic situation where returns are going down, and what is the government's response to that? It's actually to increase the number of mandates on those projects. So what's maybe some explanation for this? Now, what I proposed in the report, it came out of some research by a great economist over at Dartmouth named William Fischel, who looked at the history of eminent domain charges against infrastructure projects. And he looked at a lot of different projects, canals, railroads, the elevated railroads in Chicago, New York, and he found a pretty consistent feature of eminent domain charges throughout the life course of these infrastructure projects. When canals, railroads, even the interstate highway were first created, people, judges, politicians tended to minimize the eminent domain charges that they were given to people whose lives and land was upset by the projects. So you have a new project, a new canal that goes through your land. A judge would often say, well, you lost some of your land to farm, but you have an offsetting benefit from the canal. So I'm going to reduce your compensation from eminent domain by how much the extra benefit you got from just being near a good project. But as these projects were more built out, the cost of eminent domain continuously increased. You continuously saw people say who were in the line of elevated railroads who also said, hey, you have increased access to property. When these lines were more fully built out by the 1890s, early 1900s, people were saying, no, we're basically going to give you all of the compensation, not just from the lost air, but from the lost smoke and lost other things that you have to suffer because of this new infrastructure project. So again, the returns are going down as the infrastructure systems are increasingly built out. And, not bad. The returns are going down, the infrastructure project is increasingly built out, and the cost in terms of eminent domain are going up continuously. Now, I think this principle can basically be applied throughout the general infrastructure systems that we have in the country today. That decreased returns lead to less political demand for the infrastructure project to get carried through. The reason why the eminent domain cost went up is precisely because the public was less in demand of the project being carried through. When someone is desperate to have a canal built, they're desperate to have an elevated railway, they're going to tell their local elected official, push over the people in the way, make sure this gets built, because I have a desperate, my land is going to be 4x what it was before the project was built. When that's not happening anymore, when the marginal project is happening and the impacted individual is not as in demand, is more concerned about the cost of the projects than the benefits of it, the politicians have to create a different constituency for these infrastructure projects. Basically, before the constituency was the general consumer, the user of the roads, etc. After these projects return go down, you have to have a lot more log rolling, basically. You need to pay off the affected parties more. You need to pay off minority contracting businesses more. You need to pay off the historic preservationists. You need to pay off the environmental groups. You need to pay off the labor groups, etc. The constituency of infrastructure becomes less and less the general public and more the log rolling coalition that allows these projects to get through. And so ironically, the lower the returns, the increase the cost, and those can of course feed off themselves and create the situation that we face right now. So what are the solutions to some of this? So this is not surprising. The first solution is, in a sense, the most obvious one. It's something that we're going to talk about hopefully over the whole course of the Milstein Infrastructure and Innovation Program, is that these mandates are a real burden that are significantly driving up cost. There's no reason, if we're really concerned about the fate of an infrastructure project, to have 10,000-page NEPA reports, to have these extensive project labor agreements that are driving up costs, to have minority contracting requirements that aren't actually helping truly disadvantaged individuals, et cetera, et cetera. We can eliminate or severely limit most of these mandates if we care about the infrastructure project itself. But more important to my mind is eliminate most of the federal spending on this project, on these projects. As some of the previous presenters discussed, the whole reason the federal government got involved with canals and railroads in the 1860s and the interstates and first the highways in the 19-teens and then the interstates in the 1950s is because they were worried about interstate programs. They were worried about things that the states could not do themselves. Why is the federal government funding transportation museums and bike paths and buses that are going 20 or 40 blocks? Absolutely no need for it. A lot of these cities are sending millions and billions of dollars of tax dollars to Washington. They're going into the Department of Transportation, and they're coming back down to the city now in a more limited form and attached with a lot of mandates on top of them. There's no reason for it to make that circuitous process back through DC when these projects are purely local. And it does seem that most of the mandates on projects today are coming from the federal government, precisely because the federal government is more distant from the beneficiaries. A local official who has to care about their transit project and their citizen cares a lot about delivering that efficiently. The federal government cares much more about the national constituency, which is not composed of one city, it's composed of all of the environmental consultants in the country. It's composed of all of the historic preservationists. And so these mandates from the federal government are making a lot these spending grants in the federal government are making the local spending much less efficient than it would be. And finally, in a sense, both of these are more downstream of the real problem. That it's good to eliminate a lot of these mandates that are driving up cost, but if we are spending a lot of money on things that are not creating returns for citizens, there's no way, in fact, to get these through without those log rolling things that people are decrying. You see a lot of people today talk about the need to build out infrastructure for say climate change. And I'm actually someone who's concerned about climate change. But it's really hard to assemble a coalition as someone that say building out climate change material, it's not actually lowering their electricity prices, which is something where, I hope to talk about. I know our next speaker will be talking about a little bit. If we're building new public transit lines that aren't bringing returns, if we're building this internet connectivity, the recent bipartisan infrastructure law, of course, had this multi-tens of billion-dollar project for affordable connectivity. We already have, so some measures, 99% broadband penetration. So people are wondering, why isn't this stuff getting built? And my answer would be, well, because there's no demand for it. There's not the demand for it like there was for the interstate highway system. And one of my bugbears right now, this water spending. Recently, someone did a report in the Journal of Economic Perspective that looked at all different kind of infrastructure spending and found that one that has been very consistently bringing negative returns for decades is this surface water and drinking water spending. We actually have very clean drinking and surface water by many measures, and I'm glad it's gotten much cleaner since the 1960s and 70s. But we're having increasingly marginal returns. We're having returns that are basically trying to eliminate infinitesimal threats to drinking water at the cost of tens of billions of dollars, which New York has suffered through recently. In fact, they've seen basically a doubling of water charges in 10, 15 years because now they're mandated by the federal government to have infrared lights on new surface and drinking water, et cetera, et cetera. So in a sense, when we're thinking about how to make infrastructure efficient, the most important thing we should think about is trying to make it high return and make sure the projects we're building are actually worthwhile. So this is not to say we don't need more infrastructure. We definitely do. But a lot of the infrastructure we're building right now, including the federal infrastructure, is the wrong kind, and there's simply no political way to make it efficient. Thank you.
Terrific. Well, thank you, Judge, so much for that thought-provoking presentation and perspective. Our next and final presentation will be by Dr. Michael Wooten. He is a fellow at both the National Academy of Public Administration and the National Contract Management Association. He's also a board member of the Procurement Roundtable. In 2019, President Donald Trump appointed Dr. Wooten as administrator of the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, the highest-ranking procurement official in the federal government. He received Senate confirmation and served in that role until 2021. In his prior role as Acting Assistant Secretary for Career, Technical, and Adult Education at the U.S. Department of Education, Dr. Wooten helped lead the President's National Apprenticeship Initiative, criminal justice reforms, and other domestic policy initiatives. Dr. Wooten will discuss with us the needs of the nation's energy grid, particularly in the Sun Belt, and what policymakers should do to reinforce the resilience of the U.S. energy transmission system. And here's the report. Please feel free to take a copy. Dr. Wooten, thank you very much.
Most of you heard, I need this. Right here, thank you. So let me begin. Let's see here. There we go. Let me begin by addressing how I got to this specific topic. I had to neck down looking at a lot of things. First of all, just what area of infrastructure did I want to discuss? And it didn't take me long to decide that power and energy were at the center of most of the infrastructure challenges that we'll face. I also decided to ask, as we think about the urban areas and urbanization, what are the growth patterns? And I decided to look at those growth patterns, and you'll see that in the paper, and neck down to looking at the fact that we have Americans leaving the classical urban centers, the classical metropolises, as I referred to them, and migrating in large numbers to the new Sun Belt metropolises and their outlying suburban areas. Now, while we see that migration, for the rest of my lifetime, this is going to be the largest city in the United States. That's not going to change. For the rest of my lifetime, LA is going to be the second largest city in the United States. That's not going to change, and their rankings are not going to change. But some of the other classic or traditional metropolises will start to drop, and we'll see the ascent of the Sunbelt metropolises, and we think about those, we think about their region, and again, they're in the Sunbelt, they have some very common issues and some very common challenges, and I wanted to focus on that mostly in the paper. And one thing I'm not going to focus on, it's very important, but it deserves its own topic. We're not going to focus on what cybersecurity needs or what cybersecurity issues need to be addressed. How cybersecurity measures are going to be very, very important in hardening our electric infrastructure. Again, it's very important, but I've taken it off the table to talk about some other particular issues. So, our present U.S. power investments involve things like supporting the need for uninterrupted electric power. We live digital lives. We consume electricity. We rely on it. I don't want my AC to go off. I don't want to miss the next episode of Young Sheldon. I don't want my lifestyle interrupted. I don't want to live like what I experienced when I was in Afghanistan and power was disrupted at least 4 hours a day. You could count on it being shut down. Americans see this as an essential part of our way of life. Transmission and distribution are two other important ways of thinking about the power grid. Transmission meaning we have some centralized sources of power generation, and they're transmitted through great power lines out to get to where we live, to what we call the last mile. And in the last mile, we're talking now about distribution to our homes, our businesses, et cetera. Most of the money, most of the cost, and most of the waste is in transmission. We lose almost 60% of energy in transmission. It gets lost. And the reason for that is a problem we haven't yet been able to crack. It's a matter of physics, but we need to push a lot of power, and we need to use a lot of power to push that power over these long transmission lines, and we lose a lot of energy. And then we get to the last mile and it's distributed. I'll come back to that thought, because I think there's hope on the horizon. I'll come back to that thought. So utilities are strengthening the electric grid with resilience measures. That's something that I absolutely need to address. And later in the paper, I have a model that specifically talks about some of the resilience measures and its relationship to other factors like cost and renewability. Severe weather, that remains a threat. And again, talking about the Sun Belt, they have some common severe weather threats. Hurricanes, big deal. Associated with hurricanes, of course, floods. But the one that doesn't really attack the infrastructure as aggressively as hurricanes and floods, but is the #1 killer of U.S. citizens among severe weather issues, is heat. And of course, to beat the heat, we often demand the power. As I started out my as I began my remarks, I said, I don't want to lose power because I don't want my AC to go down. And you don't want to see all this sweating. So I am happy when AC works. But all kidding aside, that is a life-saving resource for many. It's a life-saving resource for the elderly. It's a life-saving resource for some of the young, and it's a life-saving resource for the infirm. I'll skip along here and get to the really, really busy slide. I just wanted to check and see, I owe some thanks, but let me say this. This slide here has 3 boxes that represent couplings of issues: costs, resilience, and renewability. I was going to try to break this down in subsequent slides. I'm going to show you what they look like so that you have a broad sense that this slide is an amalgam of those others. But I broke the links, so I'm not going to walk you through that. I'm actually going to talk from this slide. But here's one thing that you can see, the cost slide, the resilience efforts, and then the renewability. So I was going to do that, but instead, I will just talk from this one slide. And I think you get an idea that they can be separated. If you look at the left-hand side and you see the red arrows, that is talking about, that is helping us understand a dynamic that we deal with. We see investment in efficiency resources when we gain some money, when utilities profit, if you will, they can put some of that money into smart grid modernization initiatives. And what am I talking about? Things like using IT to detect, to find early warnings that there are challenges with the electric grid infrastructure. And being able to do early maintenance, it helps us drive down the costs. It's the lesson that I understand and should have followed with my car, which is why it's probably going to cost me $3,000 to fix a lot of the suspension challenges. Had I done this earlier, it might have been $300. We understand that in spades in utilities. So that investment can help us, and I'm following that red arrow down now to aging infrastructure. Okay, my car is a 2001. You get the point. And then that loops around to energy cost affordability. As the infrastructure ages, it becomes less efficient and can cost more marginally. But sometimes if we're not investing in initiatives such as grid modernization, we're not doing the infrastructure repairs, we feel like we're pocketing savings over the short term, much like I did with my automobile. I feel like I'm pocketing savings until that bill comes due, bam. So that's what I'm talking about there. And that's what happens with deferred maintenance. We do that all the time. Sometimes it is a strategy, it's an intentional strategy, because you have no choice, you have no money. But oftentimes this is a political reality because people don't want to bite the bullet and spend the money. So there is the deferred maintenance cycle. On this side, there's a different cycle. And I want to make sure I'm not standing in the way of it, so this is what I'm going to do. On our right side, you see the blue box, and again, from the investments in efficient energy resources, we can see the blue arrow going to investing in renewable energy and storage. And I get excited about storage because even after I wrote this paper, I've been seeing some things coming up from Georgia, and they have good, they have expanded battery storage capabilities beyond what we were even thinking was possible just a few months ago as I was wrapping this up. Great for the future. But as we invest in renewable energy and storage, we can alleviate some of our higher dependency on fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, sometimes they're cheap. Sometimes we're really cheap, and that drives us to use those. But that's not really why we tend to lean on fossil fuels, because they can be cheap, but the pricing of those commodities can be volatile. Sometimes we get a spike in petroleum costs. Sometimes we get a spike in some of the other fossil fuels. But the reason that that it's unwise to yank fossil fuels out of our grid system is that fossil fuels often supply and support generators that give us dispatchable power generation, where someone can flip a switch and have that power going. as opposed to the green or renewable generators that are non-dispatchable. This is why that's important. And I'm going to try to paraphrase something that I quoted directly in the paper. And if you get the paper, you'll see that there's a quote from PBS, a PBS show called Energy Switch. It's one of the brilliant ways of explaining what's going on with the grid. So imagine a really broad pool. I think in there they might have said of 100 miles width or something. But here's the point. A really broad pool of water, and it's only 6 inches deep. And you have a bunch of demands coming out of one end and a bunch of inputs coming in the other, and you have to always maintain that 6 inches. If you fail to maintain that 6 inches, and even though the demand is changing all throughout the day, and then changes seasonally throughout the year, you have to maintain that flow. If you fail to, you could have catastrophic grid shutdown. And that's why it's important to maintain those dispatchable power generation resources. That's why we can't just replace the fossil fuels with green and renewable. But battery storage allows us to be able to save up energy produced by green, because the wind is great, wind is cheap, but the wind doesn't always blow. Sun is great, sun is cheap, but the sun doesn't always shine, et cetera, et cetera. But if I can store that energy into large battery systems and have enough energy from those battery systems to dispatch that energy, now that's a game changer. And I believe that's on the horizon, and it's, I think, very, very exciting news. Okay, put that back there. Now, in the middle, I'm talking about some other things going on. I'll hit those fairly quickly. Enhancing grid resilience and hardening. That helps us deal with extreme weather vulnerability. That is really important. Again, it gets to what Americans expect. We expect reliable energy distribution. And then in the center here, I'm looking at the regional collaboration and grid interconnectivity. That helps us deal with poor energy sustainability and renewable integration. One of the things that I'm thinking about, I just haven't been able to wrap my hands around, is how do I get different states, particularly in the Sun Belt, with common interests, to work together for common solutions without imposing a federal solution on top of them? How do I get the states to work together without imposing a federal solution on top of them? And the key may be that much of power generation is handled by corporations. So that might be the key to getting there. So you see how these feedback loops go. In the interest of time, I'm not going to try to break down all of the flows here, but I think by walking you through it, you can see some of the main ideas that this particular chart is trying to support. Now, to the last piece. Before I speak about these, I'm going to ask you to consider something. I mentioned batteries, how I'm excited about that. I think that's an exciting technological development for renewability. One of the things that the paper talks about is Florida's great practice in burying its power lines. And I live in Prince William County, Virginia. It buries its power lines as well. My wife and I, my wife's back there recording me. I hope I don't say something stupid because she has it in her hand. But we've lived in Prince William County, Virginia for about 28 years now, and I think we've had 4 power outages, and they've never lasted longer than 2 hours. Florida has the best bounce back response of any state. Florida gets hit with hurricanes, has the best bounce back response. That's not sexy though. It's hard to get people to invest in something like that. It's not sexy. It's hard to get them to think about spending money on something that they won't miss until they miss it. So think of it this way. If you close your eyes or just picture in your mind's eye, a NICU, a neonatal unit in Florida. Think about that for a second. And think about an ad that showed a neonatal unit in Florida. And then there's a big storm, horrendous storm. Picture that in the ad too. And then you see lights flicker and power instantly restored, and those babies don't have to be shipped off somewhere in a crisis, because that is Florida. And that, I think, is one of the ways that you can put sexy back into some of these just necessary brass tacks, not so sexy but important infrastructure products. And then lastly, I would say that there are opportunities for public-private partnerships as well. And they might be willing and able to take non-sexy off of our hands, because if there is a good business model that can give them a reasonable profit, then profit is sexy in the business world. So those are some things to be thinking about. Those are some things to have conversations with the incoming group of national leaders. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wooten, for getting us excited about opportunities that may be in the front pages, but also that may be buried underground as well. With that, we're just going to reset our stage, and then we will have our panel discussion shortly after. So please feel free to grab a refreshment in the back, and we'll reconvene momentarily. Thank you.
So I came back with my sister-in-law, pretty much before up here. Came with my kids once, flying over the city. We got, it's like laid out like a picture of my kids.
Sex education content.
It's like, oh my God, it's like everything I did, like the way we get, or you know, we write also because I'm not going to write like, but he said, Oh, really? Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh my God, that's why I got those kids. This is why. That's perfectly summed up.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have them numbered, so whoever's sitting in this chair, like, gonna go 1, 2, whatever.
Oh, I see. So Mr. Claus is going to sit in the middle, correct?
Okay,
Number
so you're
3.
3. Let me see number 3. Number 3 is right there. Change this battery. I'd recommend
On the top? Yeah, sure. No problem. Thank you. Thank you very much. You guys want to get mic'd? Yeah.
I'm not sure about the numbers because I don't know how they're probably number 4 and 5. For them? Correct. Okay.
Well, I think if I'm sitting in the middle, maybe we have 2 of them together on the side because they both talk. So yeah, Michael, maybe you sit on closest to the chair with John here. Yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Here's 5. Okay. Make you number 4. Here's 5. Okay. What's number 4 should be him.
Thank you.
He's number 4. Okay.
Hey. Oh.
Number 4 is going to be this one.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, okay, great. Oh, thank you. You guys are great, obviously. And yeah, I'm giving the talk in Michigan next week, so.
They're really excited.
Okay, yeah, no, it's fun. Yeah, I just had the first call with them yesterday, so about the planning on it. Should be a good debate. Yeah, are these pretty common? These kind of like debate format things? Okay. Okay. Okay, I was curious, yeah. Yeah. No, I did, and they seem engaged, you know, especially there was the legal fellow who was like 100% because this is more his thing. The business guys were getting into it as we were talking more, so it'd be good. So what's your background? Where are you?
I worked in education policy.
Okay. Okay.
works.
Oh, great. Yeah. Just I finally gave a talk there. I'd never been there, whatever, Tuesday, weekly things. And I guess Tom Mulcair guy dragged me down there. It was fun. It was a good crowd.
particular maker.
Really engaged. A lot of people just moving right through. I never knew about it up until then. So the advantages of being in D.C.
Oh, yeah,
All right, so you got
Your
me.
base.
Oh, thank you so much, Mr. Smith. Thank you.
Got a little bit, okay. Yeah, I saw they were moving you because you were standing in front of them.
Okay, yeah, no, of course, I'll reach
Yes.
out. So are you my
Thank you very
programmer?
much.
Or do I have
We sent it out
Okay, I don't know if there's a
to public
thing.
officials,
Okay, gotcha.
journalists,
I didn't know we had to sign somebody or
academics,
something.
other policy
Okay.
experts this morning in a big email blast, and we're going to be following up.
So
with,
I'll
whoever's
just
in
reach
here.
out to you. And tell you how it goes.
Thank you, thank you. It was really a delight to
always
get
happy to do
such
it.
high-ranking
So the
folks.
tall guy,
Okay, yeah, thanks.
Well,
George
I
Goff,
actually learned
the one who spoke right before me,
Stretched it a little.
I don't know why, but
I had the timer set.
But, you know, part of it is
you
also getting
did
the
meet his
recordings,
brother, I'm
so we're
sure,
gonna be using
because
the
his brother works for
multimedia,
Leslie Field at
recording
LFPP.
it, and so we hope to
His brother's name is Porter Goff.
discussions,
So, yeah,
content,
I
in
thought
other
you-
ways
I
as
didn't-
well.
And Porter, if I remember correctly, Porter really raved about your chili.
Because at the same time, I looked at the time and said,
And yet
got to
highly relevant to people's lives, even if people
yes.
don't recognize
Things come
it.
up during the
And
discussion. I tend to tweet
these are political issues, but they're not partisan issues. They're political.
Well, thank you,
in the sense that
thank
we
you.
have to make
Thank you very
decisions
much.
about them in the common interest and in, that involve trade-offs, right? But they're not partisan many times, and here's hoping that we can come to some kind of consensus on commonsensical, pragmatic, and yet very valuable reforms.
No, it's not. It's
Thank
probably
you so much. I
overall
appreciate
lower
your
cost of living.
encouragement.
And I didn't get into the why. But I did when I did my research, but when I wrote
what
the
you
paper,
gotta do to
I don't think I spent that much time talking about the reasons that people are migrating.
Because that's a,
But I
doesn't
think-
matter. because
No,
we're
you're not
talking
getting too
infrastructure and all
right.
that,
Right.
yeah. And I didn't even know what you said there
Yeah,
about
let's sweep that under the rug.
that well taken.
You must make a lot of friends in the transit industry. I know the feeling. I've been doing that for years where I tread this.
Well, you have to actually work in it, and so I can tell I'm outside of it enough that you can be a little more blunt. Because look at these. I mean,
Well, the electricity part's not a problem now.
talking about the marginal product.
Yeah, but my wife would agree with you. Still don't want to go there because the big bad winds are a problem. And the flooding is a problem.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
Which
great.
is specifically addresses
She's not been
transit.
interested in moving
The
to
editor
Florida
got
because
nailed by the
they have the threat of hurricanes and the flooding.
5 to 5
Sitting
for
a long
my.
time.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
But
I love
if you
their
are there,
transportation
you're
stuff.
probably not going to deal with significant power outages.
Bob Poole's quoted me a few times. I don't think we've ever actually talked to him.
I was going to, I'll make sure he gets your paper.
Okay. Oh, he did. He actually got. I sent it to him. Good. He appreciated it. He said, "Oh, it's good if somebody's like, we can just do so much more PPP or PPP. You don't have to worry about most of this."
I don't know.
Again, I love his stuff, and he's right. And like, as long as it's all user fee and self-funded, that's fine. But I'm talking about like the whole universe, which a lot of this isn't. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you could please take your seats, the program is about to
Market
resume
risk.
shortly.
Yeah.
And the construction, you got to kind of think through who accepts what risks.
Yeah, exactly.
What's
I
what's
like to
the
get where
thing about
just
improving pavement.
not have to worry about
I do
meetings or
think
calls.
No, you don't think
as a result
so?
of Tuesday's
I was going to say Michigan.
a lot
The most
of
common thing is just getting things off my checklist.
big urban blue cities are
People ask me
going to start
that's
bringing
not a
back
relaxed weekend.
I mean, that's but like.
their style of
There are
government.
fewer things to worry about.
I think they have to. But once they
No, exactly. It's a lot of variability in the average.
blame Joe Biden, blame Kamala Harris, blame this and that, once they stop and they come down to reality, yeah,
I am
people are still
really, really bad.
Actually,
I have to MC a.
Why is that happening? Once they answer that question.
But
if you have a bridge that's out,
No, it's that. I almost felt bad. I should have
notes in law classes.
I should have emphasized it.
good talking.
Especially
I
because
don't
we're talking about
trust
the bridge.
myself
That's
to do
like
a better job
we
than the
need
guy
to keep
before me.
repairing bridges. We need to keep. I'm just really trying to say that we're not in a crisis situation. Like the fact that we're repairing is a good thing, but
One of
it's
the
not
perks of being
indicative of.
You know, so like, I'm like, why do I got to reinvent the wheel?
Yeah.
This
But
guy
no,
did
it's
well.
But I've
He's smarter than I am. This guy's smarter than I am. Like, I'm just gonna take
gravel
this,
roads and all the rest of it.
I'd rather read the thing 10 times than write it once. And some people have to write it. Yeah,
self-driving cars.
There's definitely a big perk.
Look,
And
your
then
car
some
depends
people,
on
they have to write it.
50%
God
of
bless
roads
them.
in
I mean,
Michigan
that's
are
the way you
gravel.
are. But
There's no
for me,
That's what I was reading about that. I was
okay.
wild about the number of gravel stuff in
But I
Michigan.
think
It's-
Texas,
Oh, yeah.
Texas probably
Yeah.
has similar.
Yeah, out there. When you go out there, it
Okay.
sticks.
No, I do. If I read it enough times, eventually.
John, should we do it?
through.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, please.
Well, in the northern states, given the weather.
Probably still want to try to end at 5, right?
Yeah, right, or maybe just shortly thereafter, yeah.
Clay,
Yeah, Wisconsin had the same
Geography.
thing. I did my,
Where's the water I stole?
grew up
Here
in
it is.
northern
Once again,
Wisconsin.
ladies and gentlemen, if you could please
I
take
think so.
your seats, the
Engineering.
program is about to resume.
Wisconsin DOT intern in the summer.
West Michigan, lots of sand and gravel. East Michigan, clay.
Yeah.
Huge difference in road
I
conditions.
have it in my
One's like a big water balloon that's frozen.
Northern Wisconsin does the same. It's dry,
right.
wet, and, yeah.
Do I have to touch on? Okay, very good. Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your continued attention in today's programming. And thank you to our distinguished authors for their contributions to this series and for the wealth of insights that they have brought to bear to us today. I want to dig a little deeper on some of the themes that have come up. One of which is, look, you know, we have migration across the country. The needs of our country change. They're dynamic. We live in a highly dynamic, mobile society. And there are going to be hard decisions that we have to make in terms of the infrastructure that we do not maintain, right? Especially if we do care about getting value for public dollars, if we care about efficiency. And so that's going to involve decisions fraught with political risk. So many of you have served in government in various ways. Tell us how you think public leaders should be making these decisions about deprioritizing low ROI infrastructure maintenance and redeploying those resources to places with more promising possibilities. Who wants to take that first?
So I would,
Yeah, please.
I would add, it depends, we were just chatting about this before, if you're looking regionally or nationally, right? What you know, if I put my Michigan DOT hat on, I can say, all right, look, I need to rebuild this piece of the interstate because it is 60 years old and it is falling apart. That's a priority, right? As opposed to, well, geez, they're doing this project 3 states over. That's a waste. Why don't you give me the money? So everybody always has their own highest priority. Candidly, I felt we base our decisions based on asset management, right? New construction, new capacity, yeah, we haven't done that for like 25 years, right? We've been rebuilding what we have, because to Judge's point, look, we have the capacity that we need, other than some spot locations where you're reconstructing it and you say, okay, we used to have 3 lanes here, it's marginally at capacity, but you know what, for 2% more, we can add the extra lane. Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense, right? As opposed to, hey, let's add this new feature to this that makes absolutely no sense. You get out to places of, way rural Michigan, it's like, well, why should we add an extra lane to I-75? 2 lanes works fine for 98% of the time. That'll be fine. So it really is about having some kind of a structured decision-making, and I would say go back to an asset management perspective. It says, okay, before you build something new, do you have the money to maintain what you have? Right. And is it in the state of good repair? That's priority number 1.
And I imagine without that asset management focus, nature abhors a vacuum, and political considerations will probably come into play, as Judge mentioned in his paper. Yeah.
The whole thing with asset management is you have the mindset of, okay, I have only one more dollar. Where should I spend that dollar? Where's the biggest bang for the buck for that dollar? Right. And that's where whether it goes to a bridge, or it goes to a road, or it goes to somewhere else. It's unusual that it would go to some of the ancillary stuff that's around the edges.
Right. Let me touch on that from a slightly different perspective, in that one of the challenges facing transportation right now is we're at a point where population is growing slow in this country, less than 1% a year, and travel per person has plateaued about 2 decades ago now. So arguably our demand shouldn't be increasing much, and we certainly have, for the most part, very good connectivity in the system. But part of the dilemma we face is the redistribution of demand.
Right.
The population shifting from the Midwest and Northeast to the South and the West.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, and I told a little story at dinner last night, 62,000 folks from New York moved to Florida in 2022. And if you play with the national numbers, each person has about 168 feet of lane mile. That means that New York owes Florida about 2,000 lane miles worth of infrastructure and probably a few buses and train cars and a plane or two to represent the increased demand that comes to Florida. In the meantime, some of those other communities have less people and then hence less economic capacity and tax base to support the existing infrastructure that may be sized for points in time when they were more populous and economically active than they are now. And that will continue to be a problem going forward that a lot of people haven't really begun to appreciate the implications of that in terms of national infrastructure and the political challenge for folks that have more infrastructure than perhaps they need, but no logical way to, in effect, scale the costs down to match it.
Well, I hope New York gets Florida prices for what we owe them. Judge, please.
Yeah, the deciding what to maintain is a big issue, and I think we shouldn't look at, I mean, obviously we've focused so far on transportation, but across that entire universe of different projects I've talked about. There is also the water infrastructure, and there's the internet infrastructure. There's the phone infrastructure, which is still pretty extensive, obviously, in a way, and it's not necessary as before. You know, there's a lot of need to reallocate to these higher projects. I mean, I did point out in my talk that, you know, bridges and roads are in much better condition, but that is not, but bridges and roads actually tend to be the highest return of all these sorts of projects we can have, much higher than the water infrastructure and the transit infrastructure. So that is the sort of things we should be focusing on. And instead of, say, you know, ever increasing minute benefits of reduced kinds of 2 or 3 kinds of bacteria in the water system that's really not hurting anybody, where you could fix a bridge that could reduce traffic accidents, et cetera. So.
Dr. Wu.
Yeah, and I would add to that, bridges and roads very important, and they make for great photo ops for ribbon cutting for politicians. But those bridges and roads need to be maintained, and that's not so sexy. And when we commit to new projects, we must commit to the perpetual care and feeding that those will require. And I think that has to go into our decision-making process when we think about where to put new dollars. I think it needs to become part of a good asset management equation, understanding the maintenance, the care and feeding of those things. And as I mentioned with electricity, we must understand the new reality that on top of all the things that we're trying to do to have constantly flowing electricity, we have to be able to add or account for cybersecurity, because the winds can knock those systems offline for a short period of time, but a good cyber attack can really do some damage to the economy, to public safety as well.
So if I'm understanding right, part of the issue here is the extreme risk aversion found in many government offices for understandable reasons, right? Civil servants and agency officials will have hell to pay if, God forbid, there is a compromise in the water security or water safety metrics. And that's true across a number of domains. So it's a matter of getting incentives right, and incentives aligned with public value. That seems pretty difficult. Seems like it's a real paradigm shift to achieve that kind of thing. Based on your experience, you think that that is something attainable, or would it require political input, political will? What would it take to get the incentives of government aligned better in the public interest on a cost-benefit basis? Yes, please.
I can jump on that one. Since I've held roles as, well, civil servant, obviously, Marine for 20 years before that, so it's still kind of in the same stuff.
Well, thank you for that.
It was an honor. Our birthday is next Sunday, actually.
Which is my birthday, too. I share with the Marines,
All right.
God bless America.
Yeah.
God bless the Judge.
Yes. But I've also held roles as a political appointee in elective office, so I can tell you there's some stark differences. The civil servant noble civil servant is trying to do a good job. They're, and Mr. Milstein gave us a great example talking about the gold-foiled chocolate and how that person valued it so much they didn't want to eat it because they don't get thanked a lot. They don't get rewarded for taking risks. They don't get rewarded for doing extraordinary things. They're held to account for making sure that things are compliant. So they're very risk adverse, and by design. So they just want to make sure that they're doing their jobs and they can't get dinged for it. They use that word ding, which drives me up a wall. Dinged. Like, what is a ding and how much does it hurt? But the public figures, the elected politicians, the appointees, they can be held accountable for drinking water. And in fact, the thing that keeps them up at night is drinking water wasn't an issue last week until it was. Until some reporter comes out with a report or some group, some population has identified that there are carcinogens in the water and they've caused some problems. Now all of a sudden they are held to account. So they have a different set of motivations. So what decisions do they make? I think they have to continue to march steadily on understanding what's going on to the best of their ability. If there is a new challenge that's brought up, deal with it. Be transparent and change the rules and get the civil servants in line. I think that's the best way to handle that. But unfortunately, we have politics as they are. And oftentimes people are very secretive about it. Even when fixing a problem like bad drinking water being identified, they're going to tend to act tribally. The left's going to do one thing, the right's going to do another thing, and sometimes it doesn't mean they want to do the right thing. Right isn't correct, not in right or left.
So there is no substitute for good leadership, especially and good political leadership, not only in front of the public, but also to cover agency officials in allowing them to do their job well.
So the common thought is, public, or, business-wise, okay, fail fast, fail forward, right? So if you take that into government, you're quickly out. Right. Because that attitude is you failed, having been the victim of probably 50 separate audits by an auditor general who's not paid to say good things, right? So there's no audit anywhere. So, oh, the department really did this really well. They did this really. Oh, you screwed up on this 1% of something, and you'd think the world's falling apart, right? So you talk about a disincentive. Yeah. Okay, look, I did 99% of all this perfect, except the one minutia piece you found that now makes it, that's the headline in whatever newspaper you're in, right? So you talk about a disincentive for a public employee. Now, look, I was a political appointee. I'm being paid to do that, right? I take those hits. But that career staff, they're going, how much more can I do here, right? I'm actually failing less than my private sector counterparts are. We're innovating, but I didn't hit 100%. I hit 99. Right. So huge disservice because they take a hit. All their family, friends, they say, well, what's wrong with you? How come you're so stupid? Well, they're not.
Of course, a huge problem, and it goes to your point about a transportation workforce, right? Getting qualified and spirited people to take on these types of jobs, and certainly no inducement under that kind of scrutiny all the time, often unjustified if they're really grasping at straws.
To Steve's point earlier in the presentation, the thing that's happening to the workforce is those that are really good, because there's so much money going into transportation, they're getting sucked out by the consultants. So you have the ones that actually need 5 or 6 more years of experience stepping to jobs they're not really ready to do yet, because the people that got sucked out are getting paid 2 or 3 times what their salary was.
Right.
I think one of the things that we forget is how customer focused a lot of infrastructure utilities were historically. I mean, the 2 main infrastructure projects we're talking about, water and transportation especially, it was funded by gas taxes, their customer was the drivers, and they felt a very extreme amount of demand from their customers to serve them well. Right now, some of their customers are the federal government, which is issuing the new regulations and serving the grants, not their customers in the local community or in the state. Some of their customers are the people who receive the grants for the transportation museum, or your gas taxes going off into a separate transit project. And there maybe should be discussion about how to hive those off from these historically limited but very effective customer-serving institutions. Water, still today, is largely water and sewer funded by water and sewer fees. It should be customer-focused, but why is it not? Because actually one of your main constituencies is the federal regulator, the EPA, the grant maker, et cetera, that you have to answer to. The way to get that incentive back is to make these customer-serving institutions, again, with a clear base. Your job is to serve the water and get rid of the sewage material as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible. And if you're not doing that, your customer knows about it, and they care about that. Your job is not to solve climate change and 15 other things. Those can be solved separately, and there's issues at it, but that shouldn't be the main job of the people that are trying to serve customers in transportation and water.
It seems like many of these authorities have moved, you can say, from a shareholder type model to a stakeholder type model, and that's going to unleash all sorts of different considerations, perhaps counterproductive ones as well.
I have a quote in one of my papers, not in this one, but there's a quote from the 1920s about who ever heard of a popular tax before? And the person he was talking about, that was the gas tax. It was one of the most popular taxes in the country because people saw clear results from their gas tax. That's obviously not the case anymore. Some of that, of course, is again about the build out of the system. Maintenance doesn't get the attention as new build before, but some of that is because that gas tax is being siphoned off and is not being used as efficiently as it was before because of all these other mandates, et cetera. If you refocus on the customers, you can get those incentives back.
Yeah. Dr. Polzin, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, a couple of observations. One is, I think particularly as it relates to the maintenance thing, there are a number of communities across the country that have done referendum for, sales taxes, et cetera, for transportation. And it is not uncommon to have, a pie of where the money goes. And maintenance has garnered some credibility. It's pothole kind of thing. So there is some constituency for that, particularly in markets where that's a recognized problem. There are things I think that the performance measurement evaluation community can do. One of the challenges is when you build something new, you typically do these economic impact studies and talk about all of the jobs and benefits, and you capture the mobility benefits, et cetera, and come up with big numbers of how much good you're going to do. The maintenance doesn't tend to get that same kind of credibility because you're, quote, not really adding new anything in terms of mobility. Once in a while you'll see folks quantify the, car wear and tear consequence of not maintaining. I've seen that. You don't see people quantify that, well, people have to drive 5 miles an hour slower and there's more travel time and hence less economic competitive because of the deteriorated condition. Or once in a while you'll see particularly with bridges, where you'll end up putting a weight limit on it, and all of a sudden commercial vehicles have to make circuitous routes, and then you can capture that. So some of it is packaging to build the knowledge base and the understanding of the importance of maintenance. In other times you can wrap it in with safety issues or technological updates to the systems, et cetera. So I think there's room for progress on that. The big challenge is where folks literally need to scale back their systems. And that's particularly true in transit as well, not just the roadway side. And transit has both operating costs and capital maintenance and restoration costs that can be huge. And there are some places that have more transit infrastructure than they can afford to take care of, and that's tough to deal with politically.
Well, speaking of impact studies and risk aversion, it's a good segue into, look, we've had environmental reviews for decades now, but they've grown exponentially in length and in complexity and time, and therefore in costs as well. What are some of the biggest obstacles to efficiency because of this risk aversion in terms of the way we are so focused on ex-ante risk? And do you see any potential opportunities to streamline some of those processes, particularly now with the new administration in the White House that, look, Elon Musk is part of it. There's going to be a focus on innovation. There's going to be a focus on cutting regulations. Do you see any promise in the future years on that front?
Let me offer some perhaps unfortunate observations on that. There is a constituency for the environmental process and its ability to be used to stymie investment, particularly in roadways. And it's a little bit of the environmental group, and it's to some extent the advocacy for alternatives, transit, bike, ped investments in lieu of that, et cetera. So they like that process. It gives them multiple opportunities to delay and challenge things. And oftentimes those timeframes are used for, well, I want to delay this till the next administration at the local, state, federal level takes office that may be more willing to reverse this decision. And so there's a lot of incentive for delay as well. And somehow it's a little bit like, some states have situations where if you bring a lawsuit against somebody and you use you're captive to the legal fees for the defense. And we need some kind of structure where there's a consequence for continuous and inappropriate delays. The other challenge we have on that is at some point you've exhausted the quantitative and information base on which to base the decision. It might be a tough decision, but procrastinating an extra 2 years with no new information coming to the table doesn't benefit anybody. It's just a delay, period. And it's a strategic political delay, not a no new knowledge delay or new information. It's an illegitimate delay.
Of course. And above all, the lawyers sure love that process as well. The lawyers are always going to profit somehow. Other thoughts?
So the group that actually likes to be able to slow them down all of a sudden was mad when their green energy projects were being slowed down by a process. They said, well, this needs to go faster. Well, look, that's the process you put in place. Right. You got to follow the process. Whatever the rules are, that's the rules.
And I put this a little bit in the paper and didn't mention it in the discussion, this is why I'm somewhat bearish on the possibilities of what's known as supply-side progressivism, the group that is particularly focused on building out certain kinds of infrastructure, mainly focused on new renewables, transit, other of these sorts of projects. And to my mind, I showed some of the stats here, these are some of the lowest returning projects. And say, for the renewable build-out, you look at a place like California, which nationally we've seen pretty stable electricity prices per kilowatt hour over the past 30, 40 years. And the places that have, quote-unquote, built the most infrastructure, not the sort of basic things that Dr. Wooten was talking about expanding to new places, resiliency, but built out all of these extreme far-flung transmission lines to renewables, the cost has gone up. It's almost doubled in the San Francisco area right now. And they're saying, well, we want to accelerate the permitting on these projects that actually aren't bringing positive returns to people. To me, there just can't be a viable constituency for that. If you're saying, well, hey, we really need to get the permitting out of the way, so yeah, we want this green project to set up that's actually going to increase infrastructure costs, where's the constituency for that? You're just transferring the benefits from one group for another, and the environmental groups that, as you mentioned, were stymieing some of these other projects, of course want to be involved in stymieing the renewable projects too, because that is a benefit, not a cost to them. And that's why I think a lot of this hope that, hey, we can just X out permitting for these new green projects, but hey, we're still going to really oppose pipelines, that's just not a viable coalition politically.
Right. Dr. Wooten, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would have added, while we're talking about, we've spent much of this conversation on talking about how permitting processes and so forth can drive inefficiencies into the process. And that speaks to something that Mr. Milstein mentioned too, and that is when we have the ability to shorten the time for a process, we decrease risk, we increase efficiencies, and that's something I think is important. Now I'm gonna take the time for a shameless plug on something, because you also talked about with the return of the new administration, and I don't know But I do wonder if we're going to pivot back toward talking about frictionless acquisition, which is an initiative that I had. That's why it feels like a shameless plug. But it was an initiative I had when I was administrator. But it really came from my 20 years as a Marine and another 10 years in DOD, understanding that in national security, speed is a quality indicator of itself. Now, there are some other things I've learned that I think help show the value of speed on the business side, on the non-defense side. Again, reducing time reduces risk. I think that's important. But I just want to remind folks that with the incoming administration, I think we're going to see national leaders put their business hats on and think about things like frictionless acquisition and how can we get the wheels of commerce moving a little bit more rapidly. And I think that'll be a good thing.
Right.
That'll improve the efficiencies.
Right, so we'll see more involvement of the private sector, more collaboration, more willingness to be receptive to innovations from the private sector. And so let's look at, this claim that often comes up that government should be doing more infrastructure. Judge, you allude to this. And in many cases, we're seeing that government is not particularly doing an optimal job, to say the least, on a lot of these metrics. There's an opportunity for the private sector to cut through a lot of the problems here. So what do you think government should be doing less of, and what do you think the private sector should be taking more responsibility for? Anyone want to volunteer? Sure.
Yeah, a couple things. One, vehicle charging. Public sector got into involvement in vehicle charging, and we don't build gas stations. Why should we charge vehicles?
They got pushed into it. They didn't willingly say so.
I understand, but, and so, that's the logical question. And if you say, well, that's critical to incentivizing and facilitating electrification, I can find, so what's the path out of government involvement?
Exactly.
Yeah. How do you transition from that? And another one that there seems to be an interest in providing parking for heavy trucks. It's a critical need. Well, really, should that be an issue that the federal government becomes involved in? Is there a private sector, or should it be handled by a lower level of government? Can there be a user fee structure for that? How do we do, and the risk to me is that there's more and more of these areas that we're engaging in. There's an interest in regulation of ride-hail services, and even regulation and deployment of bike share and all kinds of things that potentially there's a federal interest in involvement in some of these things that risks really expanding the federal role in ways that have implications.
A lot of people made fun of the Biden administration, and to my mind with justice, about they're trying to expand the term infrastructure to obviously incorporate anything that could possibly be done by the federal government, everything from child care subsidies to green energy subsidies to solar panels on roofs, etc. Infrastructure was everything, and therefore, of course, it was nothing. But I do think this is important, thinking about the world of defining kind of a sense of what we mean by infrastructure. Like you point out, charging, we don't think of gas stations as infrastructure. Why are electric charging stations infrastructure? Do we think of electric transmission, which, yes, is often subject to a government permitting system, but is often, as Dr. Wooden points out, being done by private sector utilities? Yes. Is it infrastructure? Well, it's not the core infrastructure, but it's kind of, what about internet buildup? Now, again, to me, one of the grossest sort of wastes of funds in the bipartisan infrastructure bill was this There's tens of billions of dollars of internet connectivity build out. And the reason we haven't seen a single connection is because, as I pointed out, the private sector has largely solved this problem. The FCC keeps stats on how many private households have access to high-speed broadband defined as something like 20 megabytes bits per second, enough to stream high-speed, high-definition videos. Basically everybody in the country has it. We didn't even need to have the government to have a discussion about where do we install this or something. Redefining infrastructure and then elevating it both into a government system and more damaging into a federal government system has been nothing but destructive. Most of this can be handled entirely by the private sector or by very local governments.
Yeah, I actually think there's wisdom in that framework that Dr. Glock just laid out, and that is trying to wrap your arms around what is inherently governmental. I keep mentioning defense, and 30 years of my professional life was served there, but putting armies and ships on the water, that's something that only the federal government can do. That's inherently governmental. Makes sense. But some of the other things that we talked about, we're basically poking the ridiculousness in the eye about heavy truck platforms. I love that one slide that showed that we were taxing people, sending the money to DC, and then sending it back down so we could build the transportation museum.
Right.
Only federal government can do that, really?
Let me give you another little example on the charging. The evolution of vehicle battery capabilities and charging capabilities are changing so dramatically that if you size an infrastructure to charge 30 or 40 or 50% of the fleet at it taking an hour to charge a vehicle, it's real different than 5 years from now when we have 10-minute charging or 5-minute charging in terms of the infrastructure you need to accommodate that. So again, there's a lot of risks in what we're doing as well in getting out too far ahead of the technology and ahead of market response to the technology. It's a little bit of the old, cutting edge versus bleeding edge, and where do we want to be on some of this with federal investment dollars.
The charging infrastructure is a good one. I was asked 10 years ago, why don't you put charging stations in rest areas? And I said, I don't build gas stations. Why should I do that, right? And just resist. If Congress wanted, which they did, they wanted money to go towards charging. Okay, that's great. Then allow the states to incentivize a private company to go do that, right? Then you have, to Steve's point, you have an exit plan. But what they said was, no, states, you have to own and operate it. Well, they don't know how to operate charging stations. Nobody does. There's private companies that do that. Incentivize them to go do it, right? And then, look, if there's a way that they're going to make money, they'll figure it out. There isn't going to be an incentive for any public agency anywhere in the country to make a charging station efficient.
In a sense,
most of the time, it probably will not work.
In a sense, government officials are looking a gift horse in the mouth. You have a specialist private party here ready to deploy their resources, very talented workforce.
Let them go.
Let them do it. Right.
Let the entrepreneurs figure out how to do it better and faster and cheaper.
Right. And unleash the sort of innovation and the creativity of the American workforce, which, thank goodness, is very considerable. So let's look at a specific application before we open it up to audience Q&A. User fees. We were talking a little bit about this over dinner. There is a natural appeal to the idea that those who use a service should be the ones to bear the costs of that service, especially if the value that they are deriving from it is greater than the cost. So there are some proposals, or in fact programs, some voluntary, some not, to change gas taxes to VMT taxes instead. We discussed a little bit last night about Oregon, for example, and draws out some of the lessons from those states' experiments. What can we learn about the desirability of user fees, I guess, in general, but then also some of the specific drawbacks of the programs that have been implemented thus far? please.
Go ahead.
Yeah, let me speak to that. And there is some discussion of that in the paper, and it's a kind of a classic problem that we're confronting. The motivation for looking at alternative fees is obviously vehicles are getting far more efficient, using less fuel, and the electrification results in electric vehicles not having in effect, a contribution, at least not yet at the federal level. About 30 states do have some type of usually once a year type fee on electric vehicle registrations to contribute to funding. But so that's kind of the motivation, and there's some thought that it can be a more precise measure, and in the kind of fantasies of some of the most progressive planners, there's visions of, you know, adjusting it by vehicle weight and how much you travel and where you travel and, you know, what time of day you travel and everything else. But the logic and the motivation is solid. The dilemma is it's extremely difficult to implement. There's a lot of pushback on personal privacy, whether it's a legitimate objective or not. People argue that it isn't, and that's legitimate, but politically it's a pushback point for it. It's expensive to administer because you're dealing with individuals, is where the current revenue stream of fuel taxes is collected at in effect, the regional distribution points, which are very finite. It's very efficient. It also ends up collecting taxes on gas you use for your generator and lawnmower and boat and everything else. So you're getting a little extra for the highway trust fund in there that you wouldn't get with user fees. And states and localities use that or rely on that, and we haven't had a demonstration plan that integrates the collection such that each level of government could plug their own need into the mileage fee for their geography. Nobody's kind of cracked that nut yet and figured out how to do it. There's also risks of any kind of electronic measurement system at scale, the motivations for fraud and cheating, and to me, the biggest challenge politically is, one, we need to, in effect, double the user fee to sustain current spending levels at the federal government for the trust fund, and two, you need to change the method. And there's resistance to both of those, and to combine them together and get that political will to do it, I see as virtually impossible. You know, there's people that say, oh, we're just going to change the method, we're not going to change the rate, but part of the motivation for changing the method is you need to move towards something that captures inflation and change in needs over time. So I'm kind of a skeptic of it right now. I think that, you know, the technology's maturing. I think there will be a point in time where we'll be able to do it, but I don't see the political will to do it in the near term. I suspect it won't be viable at a 2026 reauthorization time frame. Maybe more experimentation and demonstration, et cetera. I'd be very surprised if there was political will to roll that out at a national level anytime soon.
And if I recall correctly, the administrative costs for many VMT tax
Multiple
programs
times higher.
many times higher than the gas tax, which is very efficient to collect.
So, you know, one of the things that is encouraging, I would agree with everything Steve said, there's a whole bunch of hurdles in the way, but I think those of us in this industry know we've got to tackle this, right? There's a lot of hurdles. What happened in the last, I think it was an IIJA, they pushed the fact that said more people should study this. So I know in the state of Michigan, while I was director, we were not looking at it at all, said, yeah, okay, somebody else can figure this out. But the new administration came in, and with that incentive, they said, okay, well, let's at least study this. What does it look like? So it gets the conversation going, that all of these issues will come out. There's an answer here somewhere. It's not going to happen between now and September of 26. Maybe it happens by September of 30. I don't know. So at least there's more people talking about it, because by 30, it will be an issue.
Right. Well, part of this project's goals is to play the long game on this too, and to move the needle in the right general direction for political leaders to take up.
I do think it's important to, I mean, the concept of using a user fee as opposed to a tax, which it gets characterized as a tax, and that has its own stigma, is, I think, very important, because I think it gives some bounds on spending, and it gives some discipline to spending by mode and by geography. It introduces some elements of equity and responsiveness. You need to articulate the value of a project against the cost and or the revenue that project's going to generate. And I think that's valuable to build discipline into the system. Unfortunately, the transparency of use charges are so high that politically they've been a turnoff. I mean, every candidate of every party in the last cycle with high gas prices, they were rolling back taxes at the state and local level. They were tapping the Strategic Reserve Fund to push costs down. If you go back a decade and ask somebody in their long-range plan what they were assuming as the price of gas in 2025, and it was like $5 to $10. That's where we thought we'd be, and now we're cringing at $3 gas. And so we've spoiled ourselves on the price of fuel for vehicles, and there doesn't seem to be the political will to change the cost structure right now.
Any other thoughts? All right. Well, I want to open it up to questions from our audience, if anyone has them. I have other, yes, please. We have a mic. One moment, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know.
Might just take a second.
I just want to repeat my thing for the
Okay, yeah, that'll work.
So I have two questions, actually. It's a good rolling right into the fact that electric vehicles do have a heavier weight, and so therefore you would assume that they affect the useful life of your structure, your infrastructure, your bridges and your roads. And I was wondering if there was any kind of research, or I haven't read through all the papers in regards to how much useful life does it affect, and you said already figuring out how exactly to get the funds for that and make the public aware of that. And then my second question was in regards to our roads. They are used not just for personal transportation, but transportation of goods and military as well. But something that came into America's conscious for just a few days, a few weeks ago, was our dock workers union, and the fact that they are a pressure. Oh, much better. Thank you. The dock workers union, and the fact that they are a key transportation point for goods and services, and they have the potential impact of increasing it a whole lot higher. And we in America the United States of America are blessed with a lot of navigable waterways that we aren't really using as much to the ability because of the additional transportation, additional costs tacked onto the docks and such. And I'm just wondering if you had any insight into that in terms of shifting the freight transfer from roads to water, and how that might be made more cost effective.
Just for folks in the back, the first question pertained to the additional weight of electric vehicles due to their batteries, and whether the public can be better made aware of that, and what steps public officials could take to ameliorate some of the consequences of that, as well as agency officials and bureaucratic officials.
So let me answer that one. I've answered truck weight questions for 20 years. So first of all, your electric car still weighs a lot less than a standard 18-wheel truck. Roads are designed for 18-wheel trucks. So whether you have an F-150 with a gas engine or an F-150 Lightning, the road doesn't know the difference. Bridges, because Michigan has 160,000-pound weight limits, which is kind of double the rest of the country. Bridges is where the design looks different. So you drive through, and I can pick out a Michigan bridge versus a southern bridge that has lower weights. The Michigan bridge is much deeper, much stiffer, because it's got to carry the whole truck, right? Where on the road, it's spread out over more axles. So to answer your first part, it's the extra weight on an electric vehicle, meaning a passenger vehicle, is really inconsequential. When we get to electric trucks, they still got to stay under 83,000 pounds, which means they're going to carry less on the back, which makes them really inefficient. So the second half, I'll let you guys handle.
Let me just add a little bit of a supplement to the first half. We're starting to see some kind of sensitivity to the differential weight issue. Arguably, folks are saying that an electric vehicle of a similar size is about 1,500 pounds heavier than an internal combustion engine vehicle. That may change over time as we change battery technologies as well. And so, that may not be permanent. They are seeing some things like increased tire wear and particulate emissions associated with that extra weight. And there's a growing kind of sensitivity to the safety implications of that extra mass in terms of traffic accidents. But Kurt's absolutely right. It's not significant in terms of wear and tear on the infrastructure.
Yeah, to your last point, I think there's a bigger issue on the safety side. You take that Ford Lightning truck that is a lot heavier, and you look at guardrails, it's likely that Ford truck can go through the guardrails instead of being stopped by it. So I think there's a bigger impact for electric vehicles on safety than there is about wear and tear on the roads. Thank you, Steve.
On the port issue, I'll jump on my old anti-federal hobby horse for a second again. And if you look at historically, like the famous pork belly bill was known as the Rivers and Harbors Act. Like, this is the first thing when the federal government is like, we're just take a bunch of cash and just kind of spread it around the country based on who controls what committee. And I think the very first federal veto overridden was on this Rivers and Harbors Act in the 1840s. So, like, there's a long history of this, and you've seen this similarly happening today. That in the bipartisan infrastructure law, they had this port modernization effort, and what did it go to? To changing the port trucks from diesel to electric. This is not going to increase the efficiency of the port system. And as some people pointed out, they actually had mandates inside that bill that forbid automation of some of the port systems if they received the grants, which is further slowing it down. This is why, the things the federal government's saying when it's trying to speed up infrastructure are actually doing the exact opposite. They're just piling on mandates, the things the local government has a complete incentive on. Like all of these budgets, we're talking about incentives. We want to internalize the incentive to the institution so we're forced to respond to the people who get the benefits of it and have the cost of it. This is the user fee, and why it should both not be redirected into transportation museums, and why overall transportation spending or road spending should be confined to the user fee, whether the VMT or the other. And once you internalize that, ports are a classic internalized thing. If your city wants to be successful, wants to have a port, it can dredge it, it can pay for this stuff. It doesn't need to send the money to DC and have it come back later.
Laundered.
Yeah, laundered is laundered. I'll use that. It's a much better. That's
It's jarring, right?
Yeah. There's so many ways that does the government. There's so much things we send it, and it comes right back.
We used to joke in Michigan, we'd collect 18 cents a gallon from everybody, and we'd send it to Washington. They'd launder it, they'd send it back in a truck, and we'd get 16 cents.
Exactly.
Oh, that was nice.
And that 16 cents is limited in how you could spend it, and with more mandates. What are we doing here?
Yeah. As if Washington knew how to spend that money better. Yeah. Any other questions from our audience? Yes, sir.
Hear me now? Good. I'm trying to learn from my earlier experience. I'm a rail freight advocate, and I think one of the reasons rail should be encouraged is it means less truck vehicle miles traveled and less expense for whoever's going to maintain the roads. Two of the things that have been mentioned today are going in the opposite direction. I want to make that connection. Number one is the increasing amount of general resources from government as opposed to user fees. Again, that makes it less expensive for the truck companies, and it makes them more competitive with rail. The other thing is the point that was mentioned about the growing interest in government supplying free truck stops or heavily subsidized. Now, when I was working on freight trains in school, every night that I needed to sleep during the day, I was put in a hotel. That was part of the expense of, running the railroads. You put your employees up. They didn't pay for it. And they gave us meal vouchers as well. And look at other roads. In the airlines, what happens when somebody arrives in the town? They're put in a hotel. You're working on a ship, you have accommodations, same with barges. So I think that, among other things, that it helps to discourage the use of rail freight. And I think that should be considered when people are encouraging this expense.
I appreciate that, and we have not talked about rail freight, but the U.S. is actually somewhat of an outlier in the extent to which it relies on rail freight. The number of ton miles traveled by rail, and you're probably going to correct me on this rightfully, so it's like, I want to say in the U.S. it's still like 30–40% of all ton miles travels are rail as opposed to truck or plane. Now that's tons, it's the heavy stuff, but so it's your basic grains and coal, etc. But that's a lot higher than the freight transport elsewhere. That's for two main reasons. One, the U.S. has spent less money subsidizing a passenger system, which is a lower value system, but that can often divert the higher value freight traffic. And two, we had the Staggers Act in 1980, which liberalized railroad rates and allowed railroad companies to basically set their own charges. And what you saw is almost a doubling in ton miles traveled and a reduction in the ton mile cost right there. That's true what happened when the government was able to get out of the way and allow these railroad companies to actually prosper on their own. It's an amazing, you look at the graph on that. Railroad companies have basically been dying out for 100 years, basically since the federal rates were imposed in the 1880s. Down, down, down. 1980 hits, we liberalized it. This industry that everybody thought was basically of the past skyrockets. And still, one of the reasons you get Warren Buffett and others investing in BNSF and all the others is because it's found itself to be a very successful industry that does take trucks off the road and allows a lot of companies to move freight very efficiently.
Your broader point that government intervention in one market can change the overall competitive relationship up between the modes is absolutely critical, and it applies in a lot of ways. And for example, there's big national initiatives developing nationwide high-speed and partly high-speed rail services, and no federal government involvement in intercity bus, which empirically is the most efficient mode, a mode that meets the needs of a needy population, etc. And yet we don't get engaged in that, and we undermine its competitiveness if we subsidize Amtrak and passenger rail services. And it goes full circle. We'll see the same things where potential government engagement, not necessarily federal, but in regulating scooter deployment, will result in some markets not being viable for scooter deployment because they required scooters in places where there was either no market and or vandalism that made it uneconomic to be sustainable, so they pull out of those markets and we lose that modal travel choice, and that kind of thing is a consequence of that kind of differential engagement in various segments of the market that's not constructive.
Last thing I added that there is, like, as you mentioned, there's a cascading effect. The whole reason America regulated trucks for 50 years, basically from the 1930s to 1980, was precisely the railroad said, hey, we're facing competition from trucks whose prices aren't regulated. We want you to control them. They impose on that, and what happens there? You get Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters basically running the trucking industry for the next 30 years because it turns into an effective cartel. So yeah, you have to worry about these sorts of things. The government subsidizes one thing, there's a demand to subsidize another thing. The government regulates one thing, there's a demand to regulate another thing as well, and these things tend to spiral, unfortunately.
Right, contagion.
Yeah.
We have time for one quick question, if anyone has one. Wewa, please.
Thank you very much. I was wondering what you've done as far as researching alternatives, other models where there was successful governmental, public, and then private cooperation. For example, in Hong Kong, you have your subways and your toll roads that are public and privately funded. They even go internationally to raise bonds. And they've been extremely successful raising lots of money. For year after year, they're generating income from all of these projects. So what can we do to take those as models, what that is seen there? And my fun question is, what would you like to see Elon Musk do in this area?
Thank you.
I love the Hong Kong example because it perfectly illustrates the discussion we've had about incentives and user fees. So Hong Kong not only is, as you mentioned, largely self-funded, but part of the benefit they have is they own some of the land around the stations, and the land value capture and the increased values of land from the transit system gets fed back into the system itself. And I actually, John mentioned my historical research. One of my first papers I did was looking at the early streetcar systems, which themselves weren't self-funding from the fares, but they helped fund because they owned own the land that the streetcars went out to, and the increase in the value of land was enough to pay for the capital cost of that. And this is exactly what you see in Hong Kong. The costs are largely internalized, so you have an efficient, self-paying system. They gain from more ridership, they gain from more efficient system by the increased value of land and the increased fares, and that's usually enough to pay for it. There were some with the Silver Line out in DC to have this land value capture of, well, you tax some of the extra land around the transit stations because it's risen in value because of the build out, and therefore the subway system should capture some of that. But of course it was mainly federally funded, and it was a mess how they actually charged the tax. But to my mind, that's kind of in the right direction. If you can get this transit, at least incorporating some of the land value costs, it's a constraining factor as opposed to just the general subsidies.
Right.
So I was on a tour, I don't know, probably 10 years ago to Seoul, and their whole highway network and what they've built in the last 40 years, and it is all tolls, right? But it's all a private, it was set up by the government as a private company. I looked at how much money they were generating per mile. It was 20 times more than what I was generating in Michigan to maintain what was built as a free road system. So they had the ability to, as they built this system, said this is all going to be paid for by users, and they are collecting lots and lots and lots and lots of money. So the system is in really, really, really good condition, right? And I just said, wow, what could I do? How could I really help the maintenance of the poor roads if I had that? But I think it's largely when we got set up, right? The general public is used to not paying for tolls on toll roads. So when you go to change one, even if you want to take one lane and say, we're going to charge you for this lane, they say, wait. For the last 50 years, that lane's been free. I still want it free.
Right.
So the public pushback, I think, is what's going to really constrain what should be. If you're using that system, you need to pay for that system. And candidly, I think the entire interstate system all ought to be tolls.
Yes. Any other?
There are a handful of communities, and it's probably a few handfuls that use some form of value capture and to support their systems. And some transit systems, when they build, they end up owning more real estate than they need for staging, et cetera, and they'll sell that off and make money. Some are converting surface park and ride into a structured park and ride and then selling air rights for development. But you need niche and specific markets for doing that, and generally it's a very small share of total costs to do it, and fraught with risks in terms of relationships and equity, et cetera. We've never done that on the roadway side. If you think of in effect, the benefits to the farmer who happened to own the land that turned into a freeway interchange, in terms of change in land value, that was in effect given a tremendous gift by benefit of the government, and there's no mechanisms that we've had to capture that land value change and spill that back into transportation funding.
And of course, creating a constituency against any sort of transfer, yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Wood, any other thought?
I'll give you a quick response to the Musk question because nobody else jumped on that one. So he did SpaceX. He did Tesla, and we'll see how that evolves. But there's a lot of excitement about a high-speed rail, and I haven't heard him engage in that. And I think that would be interesting to see Musk tackle the question of high-speed rail. Particularly, some of the projections I've heard talked about being able to move people across the continent virtually as rapidly as aircraft. That would be interesting. To be able to connect some of the metropolises, because they're almost bleeding together, but when we have automobiles moving from San Diego to LA, for example, and we've almost connected all that. That's almost all metropolitan area now. Doing that by automobile, well, if you've ever been out in California, I-5 is basically the world's largest parking lot. High-speed rail would be nice. And of course, here on the East Coast, I-95 is the world's second largest parking lot, and having high-speed rail connecting some of our metropolitan areas might be nice. But while I say it might be nice and it sparks the imagination of us baby boomers, we might start looking at work and the distribution work in entirely different ways, so that those things aren't as efficient as we might think they are. So I'll leave it at that. That's why I'd like somebody like Musk to jump on it, though, because government can put money into inefficient things. Business leaders don't.
Well, he's also... I'm sorry.
Or they fail.
Or they fail, right. Musk has also invested in the Boring Company,
Right.
You know,
Right,
so,
which is
I mean, perhaps
towards
that...
Hyperloop. I mean, that was the vision. And that's, you know, there's other folks that have invested in that too. And there's a number of phenomenon that, you know, a few decades ago, maglev was the future and Segway was going to revolutionize transportation. And there's some characteristics of transportation that some of these kind of exciting concepts simply don't work, or don't work in certain contexts and certain markets with certain cost structures. I left Florida's looked at high-speed rail a number of times, and one group showed us a video of high-speed rail development in South Korea, and it was this massive facility where they leveled cities and mountains and valleys, because high-speed trains have to go fast. They can't change grade or alignment quickly. So you tear out lots of stuff. And in America, where environmental sensitivities and other things are so different, the costs, as California's seeing, are just orders of magnitude above what becomes economically viable.
Yeah. Well, I hope that our discussions this afternoon have proven that infrastructure need not make for boring company. You got it. And look, you know, this is going to be a conversation that we continue at the Manhattan Institute. We think it's an important topic, and we're incredibly grateful for your participation here today. Please do stay for our cocktail reception that's going to happen immediately after. And please join me in heartily thanking our distinguished guests and authors, Dr. Polzin, Dr. Steidel, Dr. Judge Glock, and Dr. Wooten.